Okay, so listen. This is still messes with me even now. I don't talk about it much, to be honest. People just look at you funny. But seeing some of the things online, figured what the heck, maybe someone else gets it. It was last fall, prime ginseng season. Beautiful, crisp morning in Ohio, leaves turning all shades of red and yellow, that smell of damp earth and dying leaves in the air. My wife, Martha, dropped me off right off 70, near Meadow Creek. We do this a lot. She knows my spots. I told her around noon 30 latest, pick me up same spot. She gave me that be careful look, even though I've been doing this since I was a kid. Woods are woods, right? You never know. Anyway, hopped out, grabbed my bag and my digging stick, waved goodbye, and she was gone. Sun was just coming up, kind of hazy, but you could tell it was going to be a nice day. Walked down that little embankment off the interstate, right onto the trail that leads back towards Willow Creek. That's where my best patch is. Been going there for years, and it's always been good to me. Quiet, peaceful. That's the thing about being out in the woods alone. The quiet. It's a different kind of quiet. You hear everything and nothing at the same time. I was probably a good mile in, maybe a bit more, just following Willow Creek path like I always do. Humming a little tune to myself, not really paying much attention, just enjoying the walk. Then I heard it. Snap. Just a twig breaking, Deer, squirrel, something like that. But then, another one. Closer. And then, the rustling. Heavy rustling in the brush to my right, deeper in the woods, off the trail. Definitely not a squirrel. Too big. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart started that little thump-thump thing it does when you get surprised. I figured deer, maybe a buck pushing through thick stuff. But the way it was moving, it was different. Too heavy for a deer, almost. And it wasn't crashing through things like you'd expect. More deliberate, if that makes sense. I slowly turned towards the sound, kind of craning my neck to see through the trees. The woods were pretty thick there, lots of underbrush and those tangled vines that trip you up if you're not careful. It took me a second, maybe two, to actually see anything, and then there it was. Through a gap in the leaves, about, 80 yards maybe, there was this thing, big, really big, and hairy, reddish-brown, covered in hair, head to toe. It was standing upright, moving through the trees, not really fast, but powerfully, like it owned the woods. Honestly, my first thought, the very first thing that popped into my head was, Sasquatch. I know, sounds crazy. I've heard the stories, local stuff, whispers mostly. Never really paid them much mind. Figured it was just old wives' tales, folks drinking too much moonshine. But right there in front of me, that's what it looked like. It walked right into a small clearing, maybe just 10 seconds of clear view, and I just froze. Couldn't move. Couldn't breathe, almost. It was huge. Taller than any man I've ever seen, easy 7 feet, maybe more. Shoulders like a bull, wide and thick, massive chest. I'm a pretty big guy myself, not small by any means, but this thing, it dwarfed me. Its arms, they were long, longer than any human arms should be, reaching down past its knees as it walked. Covered in that same reddish-brown hair, thick, matted-looking almost. I didn't see its face clearly, it was kind of turned away, but I caught a glimpse of the side of its head, and the hair, it was everywhere. It was just walking. Not in a hurry, not looking around, just moving through the woods, like it had somewhere to be and nothing was going to stop it. It never even looked my way, didn't seem to notice me at all, completely oblivious, which is maybe the scariest part. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Impossible. That's what I kept thinking. Impossible. But I was seeing it, right there, with my own eyes. This creature, monster even, whatever it was, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, I don't know what to call it, estimated its weight, just looking at it, trying to guess. 400 pounds? 500? Maybe more. Just solid muscle and bone under all that hair. It was intimidating, terrifying actually. I stood there, rooted to the spot, watching it until it disappeared into the trees on the other side of the clearing. Just gone. Like it had never been there. Except, I knew I'd seen it. I knew what I'd seen. The urge to run. Man, it was overwhelming. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn around and get the hell out of those woods. Run back to the road, back to Martha, back to anywhere but here. But I was stuck, miles from the road, hours until she was supposed to pick me up, and my ginseng patch was just up ahead, in the opposite direction of the road. Stupidly, maybe, but I couldn't leave. Not right then. Part of me, I think, was still in shock. Disbelief, like maybe I'd imagined it, hallucinated, sunstroke or something, even though it was a cool morning. But I knew I hadn't. It was real. And another part of me, stubborn part, I guess, just didn't want to give up on my digging trip. I'd come all this way. And, well, I just couldn't explain it then, and I still can't now, but I started walking again. Slowly, cautiously, towards my ginseng patch, in the same direction that thing had gone. Every single rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, every shadow, it was amplified 100 times. My senses were on fire. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I kept looking around, constantly scanning the trees, expecting to see it again, to see it, watching me. The woods, that quiet, peaceful woods I loved. It felt different, sinister almost, like it was hiding something, something big and dangerous. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like I was being watched every second. I made it to my ginseng patch finally. Hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold my digging stick. Tried to focus on what I was doing, tried to calm myself down, dug up a few roots, nice ones too, but my head wasn't in it. Couldn't concentrate. All I could think about was that thing I'd seen. Every little noise, deer snorting, birds calling, the wind in the trees. It made me jump. I kept expecting to hear that heavy rustling again, to see those red-brown hairs moving through the undergrowth. I was on edge the entire time. Never felt fear like that before. Just pure, primal terror. I must have spent a couple hours there at least. Felt like a lifetime. Didn't dig much, not really. Just enough to make it look like I'd been doing something if Martha asked. Mostly I just waited. Waited for time to pass, waited for her to come get me, waited to get the hell out of those woods. Never saw it again. Didn't hear anything else out of the ordinary, really. But that feeling of being watched, of being hunted almost, it didn't go away. Not the whole time I was there. When I finally heard Martha's truck pull up, back on the road, it was like being rescued. I practically ran out of those woods, stumbling and tripping over roots, just wanting to get to her, to get away from the trees, the shadows, the silence. Jumped in the truck, didn't say anything for a minute, just caught my breath. Martha looked at me, that knowing look she has. "Rough day?" she asked. I just nodded. "Yeah," I said. "Rough day." Didn't tell her anything about it. Didn't know how to. Didn't want to scare her. And honestly, I didn't think she'd believe me anyway. Drove home in silence, took a shower, made myself some dinner, tried to act normal, but I wasn't. Couldn't shake it. That image burned into my brain. That feeling and still crawling under my skin. That night I couldn't sleep, just kept replaying it in my head over and over, trying to make sense of it, to explain it away somehow. But there was no explanation. I saw what I saw, and it wasn't a bear, it wasn't a deer, it wasn't a person in a costume. It was something else, something ancient, wild, something that shouldn't exist but did, or does. I don't know. I still go out in the woods, you know. Ginseng season comes around every year. I still hunt, mostly fox at night, but it's different now. I'm different. I'm always looking, always listening. Every shadow seems a little darker, every noise a little louder. And sometimes out there in the dark, especially when I'm night hunting, I hear it. Deep growls, low, guttural, rumbling through the trees. Never heard anything like it before. Until that day. Never knew what it was. Used to think it was just animals, bobcats maybe, mountain lions, though they're not really supposed to be around here. But now I know. Or at least, I think I know. Those growls, they're not animals. They're out there, somewhere in the dark. And I can't shake the feeling that it knows I saw it that day, that it remembers. I still can't explain it. I've tried, believe me, tried to rationalize it, tried to convince myself it was something else. But deep down, I know what I saw, and I know I'll never forget it. Never. And that's the scary part. It's still out there. Story 2. It's still so vivid even after all these years. I was 7, maybe just barely when it happened. We'd just moved into this old house right outside of Willow Creek, Ohio. Moved isn't even the right word. More like I was just dropped there. My dad had gone. That's all anyone said, just gone. And my mom, well, she couldn't take care of me then, not really. So my older sister, Sarah, she took me in. She and her husband, Mark. They were good people. I know that now, they really were. But then, it was like being thrown into a different world. Their house, it was huge. 20 rooms, Sarah said, rambling and echoey, and old. Smelled old even, like dust and something else I couldn't place, something kind of cold and musty. She told me it used to be a funeral home. A funeral home! Can you imagine telling a kid that? I mean, I was already freaked out enough, missing my dad, being in a strange place, and then, bam, funeral home, like something straight out of a movie, but real life. Everything creaked in that house, the floors, the stairs, even the walls sometimes it seemed. And it was always cold, even with the radiators hissing and clanking. Ohio winters are bad enough, but that house just sucked the warmth right out of you. Willow Creek itself was small, quiet. The house was on the edge of town, like the last house before you were just in the woods. Woods that went on forever, thick and dark even in the daytime. And behind the house, just past the backyard that was mostly bare and frozen that January, these woods just started. Shadow Hill, Sarah called it. That patch of woods right behind us. She'd heard people in town say it was some kind of old Indian burial ground. People always whispered about Shadow Hill, about weird things happening there. Of course they did. Small town stuff. I was trying to adjust, you know, to Sarah and Mark, to the house, to everything being different. It was hard. Everything felt big and unfamiliar. Sarah was nice, she tried, but she had her own life, her own things going on. Mark was quiet, but kind, I guess. He tried to be friendly, patting me on the head, asking if I was okay. But how do you tell someone you're okay when everything inside you feels all twisted and empty? One afternoon it was really cold, the kind of cold that bites right through your clothes. Grey outside, sky all heavy and low. I was just sad, I guess. Missing my dad, missing my old house, just everything. I decided to take a bath. Sarah had shown me the bathroom on the second floor, right at the top of the stairs. It was big, like everything else in that house, with a huge old bathtub on claw feet. The window was big too, looked out over the side yard and towards the edge of the woods. No curtains or blinds on it, just bare glass. I ran the water hot as I could stand it. The steam filled the room, made it feel a little warmer, a little less empty. I poured in some bubble bath that smelled like lavender, something Sarah had, sunk down into the water, let the heat soak into my bones. It was the first time that day I felt even a tiny bit relaxed. The hot water kind of pushed away the cold, at least for a little while. I closed my eyes for a second, just breathed in the lavender smell and listened to the water sloshing around me. I washed my hair, scrubbed myself with the soapy washcloth. Just normal stuff, you know. Trying to get clean, trying to feel a little bit better. When I was done, I stood up in the tub, water dripping everywhere. Grabbed a towel from the rack and started drying myself off, arms, legs, stomach, just going through the motions. Then I started drying my shoulders, and that's when I looked up, just glanced over towards the window like you do, you know, not really expecting anything. And that's when I saw it. I froze, towel still halfway across my back, my breath just hitched in my throat, pressed right up against the glass, like literally inches away from my face if the glass wasn't there, was a face, but not a normal face. It was huge, enormous, filling up almost the whole window, and hairy, completely covered in hair, thick, matted-looking hair, like an animal's face, but shaped like a human face. Eyes, nose, mouth, all there, but wrong, covered in this thick, dark hair. The eyes, they were staring right at me, just fixed on me, boring into me. I couldn't see the color, not really, just dark, intense, and hungry. That's the only word I can think of. Hungry eyes. It wasn't like a beard, not like anyone I'd ever seen before. The hair covered everything right up to the eyes. Just these patches around the eyes that were skin, I guess. And the mouth, it was open a little, just slightly parted, and I could see teeth. Big, yellowish teeth. And the lips, they were almost hidden under the hair, just these dark lines. It was the hair that got me the most, I think, just the sheer amount of it, so thick and animalistic. It was like looking at something that shouldn't exist, something unnatural, terror. That's what hit me, pure, raw terror. Not like being scared by a loud noise or a monster in a movie. This was different. This was bone-deep fear, the kind that makes your blood run cold and your heart hammer so hard you think it's going to explode. I screamed, not just a little yelp, but a full-on, lungs-burning scream, the kind of scream that rips out of you when you're faced with something utterly horrifying. I didn't even think, just screamed and backed away from the window, stumbling, grabbing for anything to get away. I slipped on the wet tile, almost fell, but caught myself on the edge of the bathtub. I scrambled out of the bathroom, still dripping wet, still half wrapped in the towel. Didn't even care about being naked or cold or anything, just had to get away from that thing. I burst out of the bathroom, ran down the hallway, banging into the walls, my heart pounding like a drum solo. Down the creaking stairs, 2 at a time, almost tripping again. "Sarah, Mark!" I yelled, my voice choked with sobs, tears streaming down my face. "Sarah! There's something at the window." I ran into the living room where Sarah and Mark were. They were sitting on the couch, reading or something. The fire was going in the fireplace, crackling and popping, but I barely even noticed. I was just shaking, pointing back towards the stairs, gasping for breath. Sarah looked up, startled. "Lily, what is it? What's wrong?" She could see I was terrified. I know she could. My face must have been white as a sheet. "The window," I choked out. "In the bathroom, there's a face, a hairy face. It was looking at me." I was sobbing so hard I could barely get the words out. Mark got up fast, instantly alert. He was always like that, kind of calm and collected, but you could see he was ready to act. "What? A face? What do you mean, a face?" Sarah came over, put her arm around me, trying to calm me down. "Lily, honey, slow down. Tell us what you saw." I tried to explain, but it all came out in jumbled, panicked words. Hairy, big, window, face, staring, scary. Mark wasn't waiting for me to make sense. He was already moving towards the stairs. "I'm going to check it out," he said, his voice serious. "Stay here with Sarah." He went upstairs, taking them 2 at a time, just like I had. Sarah held me tight, pulling me into a hug. "It's okay, Lily. It's okay. Mark will figure it out." But she looked worried. I could see it in her eyes. We waited. It felt like forever, but it was probably only a few minutes. The only sound was the crackling fire and my own ragged breathing. Sarah kept whispering, "It's okay," but her voice sounded shaky too. Then Mark came back downstairs. His face was strange, kind of pale, kind of puzzled. "There's nothing there," he said. "I checked the bathroom. Windows clear. Outside. Nothing." But it was there," I insisted, my voice rising again. "I saw it. It was right there at the window, the hairy face. Mark looked at Sarah, then back at me. Lily, are you sure? Maybe you were just imagining things. You've been through a lot lately. No, I shouted. I wasn't imagining it. It was real. I saw it. It was right there. I pointed up towards the bathroom, my hand shaking. Big and hairy. It was staring at me. He tried to be reasonable. Okay, let's go look again. Show me where you saw it. He took my hand, and Sarah followed us, her face still worried. We went back upstairs into the bathroom. It was still steamy, the lavender smell still hanging in the air. The window was just a window. Glass, wood frame, looking out at the snowy yard. Nothing. Mark went over to the window, looked out. See? Nothing there, Lily. Just snow. And the woods. He pointed down to the ground outside. It was all covered in snow, a thick white blanket. No footprints, nothing. No way anyone could have been up at the window. He even went outside, Sarah and I watching from the window. He walked around the side of the house, looking up at the bathroom window, then all around the yard. He walked around to the back, towards the woods. He was gone for a few minutes, then came back inside, shaking his head. Nothing, he said again. Absolutely nothing. No tracks, no sign of anyone being near the house. And no way anyone could have reached that second-story window without a ladder. And there's no ladder anywhere around here. He was right. The ground outside the window was just snow, untouched snow. And it was a second-story window, high up off the ground. There was no way someone could have just been there, especially not with a hairy face. But I knew what I saw. I knew it wasn't a dream or my imagination. It was real. That face pressed against the glass, those eyes staring at me. I could still see it, clear as day. Sarah tried to make it better. She said maybe it was just a trick of the light or shadows playing on the window, but there weren't any shadows. It was a grey, overcast day, and the face, it was too solid, too real to be just shadows. She made me hot chocolate, and we sat by the fire. She tried to talk about other things, distract me, but I couldn't stop thinking about the window, about the face. I kept looking up at the ceiling, imagining it up there, just outside the bathroom window, maybe still watching me. Later that night, after I was supposed to be asleep, I heard Sarah and Mark talking in the kitchen downstairs. I couldn't hear exactly what they were saying, just their muffled voices. But I heard Sarah mention the woods, Shadow Hill. And then she said something about cries. She'd told me before about hearing noises from the woods at night, like baby cries, faint, mournful cries that seemed to come from deep within the trees. She said she'd heard them a few times since we moved in. She'd always brushed it off, said it was probably just animals, foxes or something. But baby cries? In the woods behind a house that used to be a funeral home, next to Shadow Hill, the Indian burial ground. It didn't sound like foxes to me. Now, I could hear her talking about it again, downstairs. Her voice sounded low and worried, and I realized she wasn't just hearing baby cries. She was scared too, scared of something out there in those woods. I stayed awake for a long time that night, listening to every creak and groan of the old house, every rustle of wind outside, every snap of a branch in the woods. And I thought about the hairy face at the window, those hungry eyes, and I thought about the baby cries from Shadow Hill. I never saw the face again after that day, and Mark never found any explanation, no sign of anyone, no ladder, nothing. But I know what I saw. And I know it was real. To this day, I can't explain it. Was it a person? Some kind of animal? Something else entirely? I have no idea, and the worst part is I never will. It just happened. One cold afternoon in that creepy old house, I looked up at the window, and there it was. And then, it was gone, like it vanished into thin air, leaving me with this image burned into my mind, and this feeling, this cold dread, that sometimes late at night when everything is quiet still creeps up my spine. I still wonder what it was. And sometimes, I swear, in the deepest quiet of the night, I can almost hear those baby cries, faint and mournful, carried on the wind from Shadow Hill. And I remember the hairy face at the window, and I shiver even now. Story 3. Okay, so I guess I'm finally doing this. It's been a while, years actually, and I still can't really talk about it without getting this weird tightness in my chest. You know that feeling? Like your body remembers something your brain is still trying to push away? Yeah, that's it. We moved to Redwood County back in 2015. Me and the kids needed a change, you know? City life. It was getting to be too much. Too loud, too close, too everything. I grew up in West Virginia, out in the country, and I missed it. Missed the space, the quiet, figured it would be good for the kids too. Safer. Found this place. Used to be a hunting camp, I think. Nothing fancy, but plenty of land, open fields around the house, which was great. Big yard, perfect for the kids to run around, and for my dogs. I had 4 big dogs then, mostly rescues, you know, the kind that looked like they could take down a small bear. They stayed outside in a fenced area, they were happy there, and I felt good knowing they were keeping an eye on things, even if it was just squirrels and rabbits mostly. But behind the yard, that was woods. Serious woods. Like miles and miles of dark, thick woods that just kept going and going. Redwood County is like that. Beautiful in the daytime, kinda overwhelming at night. I didn't think much of it at first. Woods are woods, right? Grew up around them. It was October, getting dark earlier, evenings were getting chilly. I remember it was probably around dusk, that time when the light starts to go all funny and everything looks different. My little house dog, Peanut, a Chihuahua mix, all of like 10 pounds soaking wet, needed to go out. He was always a nervous little guy, scared of his own shadow, bless him, but he needed to do his business. So I let him out, just walked out into the yard with him like always, standing there letting him sniff around, you know how they do. Everything was normal, the usual evening sounds, crickets chirping, leaves rustling a bit in the breeze. Peaceful, exactly what I wanted when we moved out there. And then it started. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't an animal sound, not really. Not like a bark or a howl or anything you'd expect from the woods. It was a moan. But not a human moan, not exactly. It was deeper, much deeper, and drawn out. So long, like so long. Starting low, almost a rumble, and then it built. It got louder and higher, but still deep at the same time. It was like pain, but huge, like something enormous was hurting, really, really hurting, and letting out this sound. It came from the woods, deep in the woods, from that black wall of trees right at the edge of my property. Instantly, every hair on my arms stood up, not just goosebumps, but like actual hairs lifting up. A shiver. A real icy shiver went right down my spine and settled in my stomach. My heart started to pound, like it wanted to beat right out of my chest. Everything inside me just tightened, pure, raw fear just gripped me. The light was fading fast, going that weird purplish-grey color you get at dusk. I spun around, trying to see into the woods, into the shadows that were already thick under the trees. Branches were bare for fall, so you could see a little ways in, but it was just dark. Deep, swallowing dark. Nothing moving, nothing visible, just the trees and the undergrowth, and that feeling of something watching. The moan came again. Just as long, just as deep, just as terrifying. It vibrated in the air. You could feel it in your chest, in your bones. It wasn't just a sound you heard. It was something you felt. It filled everything. I looked down at Peanut. Poor little guy. He was frozen, absolutely stock still. All 4 legs locked, staring into the woods, trembling so hard his whole body was shaking. His little tail was tucked so tight between his legs it was practically inside him. His eyes were wide, black saucers of pure terror. He didn't make a sound, not a whimper, nothing, just paralyzed. I knew then, whatever that was, Whatever made that sound, it was really bad. Something primal in my brain just screamed, "Danger!" I scooped Peanut up, he was stiff as a board, and bolted back to the house. Didn't even think, didn't look back, just ran, got inside, slammed the door, locked it, flipped the deadbolt, and stood there breathing like I'd run a marathon, Peanut still shaking in my arms. Then it hit me. The big dogs. They were outside. They should have been barking. They barked at everything, cars, squirrels, leaves blowing, you name it. But they were silent. Completely silent. And they were out there, between the house and those woods. My blood ran cold, worse than before, way worse. My big tough dogs, silent, after that sound. What had it done to them? Had something gotten them? Were they hurt? Or worse? I peeked out the window, into the yard. Couldn't see anything in the growing darkness. Just the empty yard. No dogs barking, no sounds from them at all. Just silence. Except for the woods. That low, deep silence that always feels heavy and full of secrets. Secrets I definitely did not want to know. I was terrified to go back out there. Honestly, I was shaking so bad I could barely hold the gun steady, even just standing in the living room. I had a handgun, for protection, just in case. Never thought I'd actually use it. Never thought I'd be this scared in my own home. I grabbed the gun, checked the safety a dozen times, and just barricaded myself in. Locked all the doors, closed all the curtains, made sure the kids were in their rooms, asleep. Tried to act normal for them, but I was a wreck inside. Just sitting there in the dark, with the gun in my lap, listening for any sound from the dogs, listening for that moan again, listening for anything. The silence from outside was deafening, except for the woods. I swear I could still feel that vibration from the moan, even though it hadn't come again. It was like the air itself was still ringing with it. I didn't sleep that night. Not a wink. Every creak of the house, every rustle outside the window made me jump. I kept imagining things, shadows moving in the woods, eyes watching me from the dark. Monsters. Stupid, I know, grown woman scared of monsters. But that sound, it just did something to you. Made you believe in things you didn't want to believe in. The night felt like it lasted forever. Slowest, longest, most terrifying night of my life. Just waiting for dawn, waiting for the sun to come up, hoping whatever it was gone when the light came back. Finally, the first hint of grey in the sky. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the darkness started to fade. As the light got stronger, I got a little braver, just a little. Crept into the kitchen, peeked out the window towards the dog pen. And there they were, all four of them, standing there, looking perfectly fine. Tail wags, ears perked up, looking around like nothing had happened. Totally normal, like they'd slept through the whole night, peaceful as could be, not a scratch on them, not a sign of anything wrong. They didn't even seem bothered by anything. Relief just washed over me in a huge wave. I almost collapsed. They were okay. My dogs were okay. Whatever had made that sound hadn't gotten them, hadn't hurt them. Maybe it was just some weird animal, a sick coyote or something. Yeah, that had to be it. Something natural, something explainable. I had just freaked out over nothing. For 2 years, nothing else happened. Life went back to normal. Well, as normal as it can be with 2 kids and 4 big dogs and living out in the middle of nowhere. We settled in, got used to the quiet, the dark, the woods. I almost forgot about that night. Almost convinced myself it had been a bad dream, or just my imagination running wild because I was still adjusting to being out in the country again. Then it was October again, 2 years later, October 2017. I remember it was a Thursday, I think. My husband was away on a business trip. I was alone in the house with the kids and the dogs. It was around 8:30 p.m. Kids were in bed, finally asleep. I was just starting to relax a little, maybe watch some TV when I heard it. The moan. Instantly, everything came flooding back. Every bit of that terror, that icy fear, that feeling of dread. It was exactly the same. Exactly. That low, drawn-out, painful moan coming from the woods. Just as loud, just as deep, just as gut-wrenching. It was like time just collapsed. 2 years disappeared. I was right back there in the yard at dusk, frozen with fear. The memory was so vivid, so immediate, it was like it was happening all over again. This time, I knew what it was. Or at least I thought I did, because in those 2 years I'd done some research. Late at night, when I couldn't sleep, when the woods outside seemed to press in closer, I'd gone online, Googled weird sounds in the woods, animal noises, unexplained phenomena, stuff like that, and I'd found it, the Ohio howl. People talking about this strange, long, moaning sound they'd heard in the woods, mostly in Ohio, but also in other states, describing it exactly like I'd heard it, calling it a Bigfoot vocalization. Bigfoot. I know, sounds crazy. I used to think it was crazy too. But reading those accounts, listening to recordings of what people thought was the Ohio howl, it was the same sound. Exactly. No doubt in my mind. So, when I heard it again that night in October 2017, that's what I thought. Bigfoot, or whatever you want to call it, some kind of huge, unknown creature out there in the woods, making that sound. This time the big dogs reacted instantly. They didn't bark, not at first. They started whining, low, scared whines, and then they started pacing, running back and forth along the fence line, ears flat, tails tucked, terrified, just like Peanut had been that first night. The moaning started again, and again. It went on and on, not constantly, but every few minutes, long, drawn-out moans echoing through the woods, filling the night with dread. My dogs were going crazy, pacing, whining, whimpering, trying to hide. They were usually so tough, so brave. But this sound just stripped them of everything, turned them into shaking messes. Night after night, it kept happening. Every night, starting around the same time, 8:30, 9 p.m. The moaning would start, and the dogs would freak out. It would go on for hours, sometimes all night long, every night for weeks, the whole month of October. I was losing my mind, sleep-deprived, terrified, constantly on edge. The kids started to notice the dogs were acting weird, started asking questions. I tried to play it down, told them it was just owls or something. They seemed to believe me mostly, but they could feel the tension in the house. I know they could. Then one night it got worse. It was probably a week or two into this nightly torment. The moaning was going on. The dogs were at their usual state of panic. Suddenly I heard a different sound, a frantic scratching, and then a loud thud, and then more scratching. I jumped up, heart hammering, grabbed the gun again, went to the back door, listened. The scratching was coming from the door itself, the wooden back door, like something was trying to get in, peeked through the peephole, and I almost screamed. It was my dogs, all 4 of them, standing at the back door, on their hind legs, paws up against the wood, clawing at the door, scratching and whining, trying to get inside. They had never, ever done that before. Never tried to come inside the house unless I specifically let them in. They were outside dogs. They knew it. They were fine with it. But tonight, they were desperate, terrified beyond anything I'd ever seen. They were literally trying to claw their way into the house. I opened the door. They didn't even wait for me to tell them to come in. They just piled in, all 4 of them, pushing past me, scrambling inside. They ran straight into the living room and hid under the furniture, under the couch, under the chairs, trembling, panting, eyes wide with terror. They stayed inside that night, and every night after that. As long as the moaning went on, they stayed inside. They wouldn't go out, not even to pee. They were too scared, and I was terrified too. If my big, tough dogs were that scared, what was out there? What was making that sound that could terrify them like that? Something that could drive them to claw their way into the house, breaking their own rules, just to get away from it. October ended. November came. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the moaning stopped. Just gone. Silence in the woods again at night. The dogs slowly, gradually started to calm down, started to go back outside during the day, then eventually at night again. Things went back to almost normal, but not really. Not for me. That fear, it never really went away. Even now, years later, when October comes around, I get this tightness in my chest. I find myself listening at night, waiting for that sound. I still live here, in Redwood County, in the same house, next to those woods. I haven't heard the moaning again since that October, but I know it's still out there. Something is out there, in those woods. Something big, something unknown, something that makes that sound. And I have no idea what it is. And honestly, I really don't want to know. Sometimes, the not knowing is the scariest part of all. Story 4. That day, it was maybe early afternoon when we decided to head home. We took 12 north like always. That's the way we go back to our place from Serpent Mound. It was a nice day, sunny, not too hot for late summer. Windows down in the Jeep. We were talking about lunch, maybe stopping for a bite in Waverly, just normal stuff, you know. We were coming up on the Black River Creek Bridge, and it's just a reflex now, something I do without even thinking. Whenever we cross a creek, any creek really, I always glance over to the side, especially if it's one I haven't walked before. Just a quick look to see if the water's low enough, if there's good bank exposure, places where artifacts might wash out. It's automatic. I'm not expecting to find some ancient burial site every time. It's just a habit. And honestly, most of the time you see nothing, maybe a deer or some kids fishing. But this time was different, very different. As we got closer to the bridge, I did my usual glance to the right, towards the creek. And that's when I saw them, just off the bridge, maybe 20 yards at most from the road, on the creek bank. 3 figures, black figures. My first thought, and I swear this was instant, was fishermen. It was the creek, the location. You just naturally think people fishing. But even as that thought formed, it was already dissolving. Because even from the moving car, even just for a split second, I could see. There were no fishing poles. And these weren't people, not like any people I'd ever seen. Disbelief. That's the only word that even comes close to describing what hit me. Pure, unadulterated disbelief. It was like my brain couldn't process what my eyes were showing me. What have I seen? I remember thinking, the question echoing in my head, but not even forming words, just this silent, stunned confusion. We crossed the bridge, just like that. Boom, boom, the tires on the bridge surface. Everything felt normal, the car humming, the sun shining, the normal sounds of driving. But inside, in my head, it was like a bomb had gone off. The smaller one, it was in the creek itself, ankle deep in the water, closer to our side of the bank. It was child-sized, maybe like my granddaughter Lily, 8, 10 years old, something like that, but black, completely black. The other 2 were on the bank, on the far side of the creek. They were huge, absolutely massive. I'm 6 feet tall, maybe a bit over, and these things, they dwarfed anything I could even imagine. 8 feet, 8.5 feet maybe, easily. They were towering and muscular, not just big but powerfully built, like gorillas, but standing upright and even bigger than that. And the hair, everywhere, all of them, head to toe, covered in jet black hair. It wasn't fur, not like an animal's fur. It was hair, human-like hair, but incredibly thick, incredibly black, and it covered them completely. You couldn't see skin, you couldn't see clothes, just black hair. The whole thing, the sighting, it lasted maybe 5 seconds, 10, tops. We were doing about 45, maybe a little less, crossing that bridge. It was just a flash, a snapshot, but it's burned into my mind, seared. I didn't say anything right away. I think I actually forgot how to speak for a minute. Sarah was talking, something about Waverley still, I think, but her words were just background noise. My mind was stuck on what I'd just seen, those black figures, in the middle of nowhere by a tiny Ohio creek. Then finally I think I just blurted it out. Did you see that? My voice sounded weird, almost like someone else's, rough, shaky. Sarah looked at me, a little confused. See what, David? What's wrong? I didn't know how to explain it. How do you even begin to explain something like that? By the creek, just back there. Did you see anything? She frowned, thinking. The creek? No, honey, I was looking at the road. What were you looking at? And that's when it really hit me. She hadn't seen them, just me. I was the only one who saw whatever those things were. I tried to describe it to her. There were figures by the creek, 3 of them, black, hairy, big, really big. My words were coming out in pieces, disjointed, like I was trying to translate something from a language I barely knew. Sarah looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Black figures? David, are you feeling okay? What are you talking about? I knew how crazy it sounded. I knew it. Even to me, saying it out loud, it sounded like a hallucination, like something out of a bad dream. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew it was real, or real to me at least. No, seriously, Sarah, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but I could feel my hands starting to shake on the steering wheel. Just before the bridge, on the right side, 3 things, black and hairy, 1 small, 2 huge, by the water. She looked at me again, her brow still furrowed, but I could see a flicker of something in her eyes now. Maybe doubt, maybe concern, maybe just the beginning of realizing I wasn't joking. David, she said slowly, I didn't see anything like that. Are you sure you're not just imagining things? Maybe you're tired from Serpent Mound? It was a long morning. Tired? Yeah, maybe. But this wasn't tiredness. This was something else. Something profound and unsettling and terrifying in a way I couldn't put my finger on. Sarah, I know what I saw, I said, my voice stronger now, conviction building. I know it sounds insane. I know it does. But I saw them, clear as day. 3 black, hairy figures by the creek. I'm telling you, I did. She was silent for a moment, just looking at me. Then she reached over and put her hand on my arm, a gentle, reassuring touch. Okay, she said softly. Okay, David. I believe you. I believe you saw something. It wasn't quite belief in what I'd seen, I knew that. It was belief in me, in my sanity maybe. And that was enough, in a way. Just having her not dismiss me outright, that helped. We drove the rest of the way home, mostly in silence. The conversation about lunch in Waverley was completely forgotten. My mind was racing, replaying that image over and over again. Those black shapes, the size of them, the hair, no features, no faces, just blackness and hair, and the lack of explanation. That's what was really eating at me. What were they? Animals? Some kind of bear? But bears aren't that big, not in Ohio, and they're definitely not black like that, not jet black, and they don't stand like that. Upright, human-like, but not human people. Could they have been people, in some kind of costumes? But why? In the middle of nowhere, by a creek, in the middle of the day. And those sizes, no costume could make someone 8.5 feet tall, not believably. And again, the hair, head to toe. It didn't look like clothing, it looked organic somehow. Part of them. I tried to rationalize it, tried to find some logical explanation, but every explanation fell apart almost instantly. It was like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole over and over again. We got home, parked the Jeep in the garage. We went inside. The house was cool and quiet. Normal. But I wasn't normal. I felt off-kilter. Like I was living in 2 realities at once. The normal, everyday world of our house, our life, and this other, unsettling, impossible reality that had just brushed against mine by Black River Creek. I went online later that evening, started searching. Black creatures, Ohio, I typed into Google. Hairy figures, Ohio woods. Strange sightings, Ohio creeks. Anything at all that might shed some light on what I'd seen. I found a few things, the usual Bigfoot stuff, some old Native American legends about forest spirits, the kind of stories people tell around campfires. Nothing concrete, nothing that felt real, like what I had experienced. Most of it was blurry photos, shaky videos, stories from people who seemed less than credible, but some of it resonated. Stories about shadowy figures seen in the woods, near water, always on the periphery of vision, just glimpses, just flashes. Stories that were dismissed, ridiculed. Stories that sounded just as crazy as mine probably did. I didn't find anything specific to Black River Creek, nothing that matched exactly what I'd seen. But the feeling of unease, the feeling that there was something out there, something hidden, something unexplained, that was there, in those stories, just beneath the surface. Days turned into weeks. I didn't talk about it much, not to anyone else except Sarah. We talked about it sometimes, quietly at night. She was supportive still. She said maybe I had just seen something unusual. Maybe there was a rational explanation we just hadn't thought of yet. She tried to be practical, but I could see it in her eyes too. A hint of uncertainty, a flicker of doubt. Maybe she didn't completely believe me. Not really. But maybe, just maybe, a small part of her wondered if there was something more to it. I've driven Highway 12 north since then, dozens of times. We still go to Serpent Mound occasionally, still do our creek walking. Every time we approach that bridge over Black River Creek, my heart does this little jump in my chest. I always look to the right. Always. And I never see anything, just trees, the creek flowing, sometimes a deer, sometimes nothing at all. But in my mind, I see them. Those three black figures, standing by the creek bank, watching, or maybe just being. I don't know. I don't understand. And that's the thing that gets to me. The not knowing, the absolute complete lack of any explanation. It's been months now, and I still think about it almost every day. What did I see? What were they? And why? Why were they there in that place at that time? I have no answers. None at all. And I know, deep down, that I probably never will. It's just something I saw, something that happened, a glimpse into something else. And it's just out there, still, somewhere. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night in the dark and quiet, I think about those black figures again, and I get this chill, a cold, deep chill that runs right down to my bones, because I know what I saw, and I know that I don't know what it was. And that's the scariest part of all, just not knowing. And the feeling that something utterly inexplicable, something completely outside of my understanding of the world, is real, that it exists, and that I saw it, just for a few seconds, by a creek in Ohio. And then it was gone, just gone. Story 5. Okay, so this happened back in 2019. September, I remember that clearly because it was right before everything went downhill, you know, before the world went crazy. Bridgeport, Ohio, that's where I live, and it's quiet, peaceful mostly, which is why what happened freaks me out so much to this day. It wasn't supposed to happen here, not to me. I'm into archery, always have been. Something about the focus, the quiet, the way it connects you to nature, I guess. Anyway, there's this archery range out on Black Bear Trail, Pinewood Archery Range. It's not fancy, just targets set up in the woods. But it's perfect for practice. I go there pretty regularly, especially on my days off. This particular morning, I remember I woke up early, like 6:30 maybe, just felt like getting out, you know. The air was already getting that crisp September feel, leaves starting to turn just a little. I grabbed my gear, bow, quiver full of arrows, the usual stuff, drove out to Pinewood, Got there maybe around 7:15 a.m., still pretty early, sun just coming up, casting long shadows everywhere. The range was completely empty, which was normal for that time. I liked it that way, the peace and quiet. I walked to the 40-yard target, set up and started shooting. Just warming up, focusing on my form. You get into a zone when you're shooting, you know? It's almost meditative. But something broke that focus pretty quick that morning. I was drawing back for maybe my third or fourth arrow, pulling back, sighting, and I caught something in my peripheral vision. Movement, out beyond the target in the woods. Not deer, not a squirrel. It was different. I lowered my bow slowly, heart starting to pick up a little. Just stood there, arrow nocked, staring out into the trees. The range is set up so the targets are kind of in a little clearing, and then the woods start right up. Thick woods, oak, maple, pine, all that Ohio stuff. It was right at the edge of the trees. Movement again, something shifting behind a big oak tree. Now, usually if you see movement in the woods, you expect an animal, right? Deer, raccoon, maybe a fox. But this didn't look like any of that. It was low to the ground and weirdly shaped. I stepped a little closer, still holding my bow. My mind started racing. Was it a bear cub? Too small, wrong shape. A really big dog, maybe wandered off, but it was too compact. I took another step, squinting. The shadows were still pretty long, making it hard to see clearly, and then it moved again, just a tiny shift, like someone peeking around something, and I saw it. Just a glimpse at first, and my brain... It kind of short-circuited for a second. Behind the oak, pressed up against the trunk, was this thing. Small, definitely small. 4, maybe 5 feet tall, max. Covered in hair. Dark hair, kind of shaggy looking. And it was peeking around the tree trunk, just its head and part of its shoulder, looking right at me. I froze. Not out of fear, not at first. More like complete and utter disbelief. What the hell was I looking at? It wasn't a person. Definitely not a person. Too small, too hairy, and the way it was pressed against the tree, like it was trying to hide, but still wanted to watch. My curiosity just took over. Pure, dumb curiosity. I know in hindsight it was stupid. I should have freaked out, run, I don't know. But in that moment, all I felt was this intense fascination. Like I was seeing something I wasn't supposed to see. Something impossible. I slowly raised my bow again, more to have something to do with my hands than anything else. Drew back, aimed at the target. The creature, I guess I'm calling it a creature now because animal just didn't fit. It didn't move. Just stayed there, pressed against the tree, head turned, watching me, like it was completely absorbed in what I was doing. I released the arrow. Thwack! Good shot, bullseye. Normally I'd be feeling good about that, but I was still completely focused on the thing in the woods. It hadn't flinched, hadn't run, just stayed put, watching. Okay, I thought. Let's see what happens when I go get my arrows. That's when things got weirder. I started walking towards the target, keeping my eyes on the tree. The creature reacted, not by running away into the woods. It just ducked back, melted back behind the tree trunk, vanished, like it had been pulled back by a string, just gone. I reached the target, pulled out my arrows and straightened up, looking back at the oak tree. Nothing, just the tree, the woods, the early morning sunlight filtering through the leaves. I waited. Silence. No rustling, no snapping twigs, nothing. Had I imagined it? Was it just a trick of the light? Shadows playing games with my eyes? No. I knew what I'd seen. And I knew it wasn't a deer or a dog or anything normal. I walked back to the firing line, loaded another arrow, just stood there for a second, staring at the oak tree. Heart was definitely beating faster now. Not just curiosity anymore. There was a knot of unease forming in my stomach, but still, I had to know. I drew and shot another arrow, another good shot, right next to the first one. And again, the moment I released the arrow, I looked towards the tree. And there it was again, peeking out, just its head and shoulder, still watching me. This time I noticed more details. The hair wasn't just shaggy, it looked coarse, like animal fur, but thicker. And the skin I could see, around the edge of the hair, looked almost grey. Pale grey, not human skin color. And the eyes. I only got a glimpse of them, but they were dark, very dark, and they seemed intelligent, too intelligent for an animal. I walked forward again to retrieve my arrows, and just like before, as soon as I started moving, it vanished, ducked back behind the tree, and reappeared when I got back to the firing line, peeking again, watching. This bizarre game went on for maybe 20 minutes, maybe longer. I'd shoot, it would watch. I'd walk forward, it would disappear. I'd walk back, it would reappear. Silent, no sounds from it at all, just watching, and me watching it. It was the strangest thing I've ever experienced. Unreal, like I was in some kind of dream or a bad joke. With each repetition, the unease grew. Curiosity was still there, burning, but it was mixed now with something colder, a creeping sense of dread. This wasn't playful. It didn't feel natural. There was something fundamentally wrong about it, about the way it watched, the way it moved, the way it existed. I started to get this prickly feeling on the back of my neck, that feeling like you're being watched, but amplified, like something heavy and malevolent is focused on you. I glanced around, scanning the woods behind me, the trees to my sides. Nothing. Just the woods. Quiet. Still. But the feeling, it was intense. And then I had this sudden thought, a jolt of clarity, like waking up from a trance. I need to get a picture. That was it. Proof. I had to have proof of this. Nobody would ever believe me otherwise. They'd think I was crazy, hallucinating, sunstroke, whatever. I needed my phone. It was in my truck, parked back near the entrance to the range, maybe 100 yards away. It felt like a long way all of a sudden. I lowered my bow, carefully laid it down on the target stand. My hands were shaking just a little, not from cold, from nerves. A mix of excitement and fear all tangled up together. Okay, I told myself. Just go to the truck, get your phone, come back, easy. Don't spook it. Move slowly, quietly. I started walking back towards the entrance, keeping my eyes fixed on the oak tree. It was still there, still peeking, watching me move away. I didn't want to turn my back on it completely. Felt wrong, stupid maybe, but I just couldn't. I walked backwards for a few steps, then turned and started walking forward, but angled so I could still keep the oak tree in my peripheral vision, moving as quietly as I could, trying to be casual, like I was just going to adjust my equipment or something. Got to my truck, unlocked the door, grabbed my phone from the dashboard. Stomach was churning now, heart pounding. I felt like I was doing something really, really stupid, but I had to get that picture. Had to know if this was real or if I was losing my mind. Phone in hand, camera app open, I started walking back towards the target. Walking faster now, almost jogging. Adrenaline pumping. I could practically feel the creature watching me, even though I couldn't see it yet through the trees. I broke out of the trees into the clearing, back to the firing line, back to the 40-yard target. And nothing. The oak tree. Just the oak tree. Sunlight filtering through the leaves. Birds chirping somewhere in the distance. Silence. No movement. No peeking head. Just empty woods. It was gone. Vanished. Completely and utterly gone. I stood there, phone in hand, camera pointed, staring at the tree. For minutes I just stood there, scanning the woods, every shadow, every bush, every tree trunk. Nothing. It was like it had never been there. Like it had been a hallucination, a figment of my imagination. But I knew it wasn't. I knew what I'd seen. I could still see it in my mind, so clearly. The dark hair, the grey skin, the dark, intelligent eyes, watching me. I walked over to the oak tree, slowly, cautiously. like it was some kind of trap. Circle around it, look behind it, around it, up into the branches. Nothing. No tracks in the leaves, no broken twigs, nothing to indicate anything had been there, just gone, like it had blinked out of existence. I stayed at the range for another hour maybe, wandering around, searching the woods, calling out, stupidly, "Hello? Hello?" Like it was going to answer me, like it was just playing hide and seek and would pop out and say, "Boo!" But nothing, just the woods, silent and indifferent. I left eventually, drove home in a daze, kept looking in my rearview mirror like I expected to see it running after me. Crazy, I know. I've been back to Pinewood Range a few times since then. Plenty of times. Never seen anything like it again. Never felt that same feeling, that sense of being watched, that cold dread. It's just a normal archery range now. Quiet, peaceful, ordinary. But I know what I saw that morning. I know it wasn't a deer or a dog or my imagination. I saw something else, something I can't explain, something that shouldn't be there, but was, for a little while at least. And to this day, every time I go back to those woods, every time I draw my bow, I can't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, it's still watching, hidden behind the trees, waiting, and I have no idea what it was or what it wanted. And that's the part that really gets to me, the not knowing, the absolute mystery of it all. It just vanished and left me with this thing, this memory, this question mark burned into my brain that I can't get rid of, and I don't think I ever will. Story 6. Okay, so something messed up happened to me a few years back, and I've been turning it over in my head ever since, trying to make sense of it. I haven't really talked about it much, except to my fiancée, now wife Sarah, but lately it's been bugging me again, like something is just stuck in my mind. So, figured maybe writing it out, even for strangers online, might help. Maybe someone's seen something similar, I don't know. It was July 23rd, 2019, a Tuesday. I remember because it was right before her birthday, and we were just trying to relax and enjoy the summer before things got too crazy with work. We lived in a small town outside Amberton, Ohio, still do. Back then, we had this old four-wheeler, a bit beat up, but it ran fine. We liked taking it out on the back roads around here, especially at night sometimes. It's quiet, you know, and the stars can be pretty amazing away from the town lights. That night, we'd finished dinner kind of late, maybe around 9. Sarah suggested we take the four-wheeler for a quick spin. I was up for it. It was warm, not too humid. The kind of night where just being outside felt good. We put on jeans and hoodies, just in case it got a little chilly later. Packed a couple of water bottles, you know, just being responsible, and headed out. We took back roads, nothing fancy. Mostly just gravel and dirt roads. We were heading towards Crestview Drive. Crestview isn't really a drive. More like a barely paved road that winds up this pretty steep hill. It's kind of out in the sticks, even for around here. Not many houses up there. Mostly woods and fields. We liked going up Crestview sometimes because from the top of the hill you could see pretty far, especially at night. It was probably around 10, maybe a little later, when we got to Crestview. It was dark, obviously. Headlights were on, the only real light out there except for the moon, which was maybe half full, not super bright but enough to see shapes in the fields. We started up the hill, the four-wheeler working a little harder on the incline. It's a bumpy ride, Crestview. The road is cracked and uneven in places. I was driving, Sarah was behind me, holding onto my waist like she always did. We were talking about something dumb, probably work, or what we were going to watch on Netflix later, just normal stuff. We were laughing about something. It was a good, easy night. Then we rounded this curve, and the hill got even steeper. The headlights pointed up the road, cutting through the darkness. And that's when it happened. My headlights hit it. Whatever it was on the left side of the road, just there, like it had just stepped out from behind a tree. This huge, dark tree, like one of those old oaks, the kind with thick, gnarly branches. And this thing was right next to it, maybe 10 feet in front of us. It was standing perfectly still in the beam of my headlights. The first thing that hit me, the absolute first thing, was the size. It was massive, like impossibly big. I'm not exaggerating when I say it looked 7, maybe 8 feet tall, minimum. It towered over the four-wheeler. It made the trees behind it look small, and those were big trees. The second thing was the darkness of it, not just the night darkness. This thing was darker than the night. It was like it sucked the light in. It was black, but not like fabric black or shadow black. It was like void black, like looking into a hole where there should be something solid. It was shaped like a man, kind of, upright, 2 legs. I could see a torso, shoulders, even what looked like a head at the top. But wrong. Everything was wrong about it. It was too broad, too thick. The shoulders were way too wide. The head, I don't know if it even had features. It was just a darker mass at the top. And it was just standing there, completely motionless, like a statue made of shadow. My brain just stopped. Everything stopped. The laughter, the conversation, the noise of the four-wheeler, everything. For maybe a second, 2 seconds, I just stared at it, frozen. My hands were gripping the handlebars so tight my knuckles went white. Then pure, unadulterated terror hit me, like a physical punch to the gut. I've never felt fear like that before, and I hope to God I never feel it again. It wasn't just fear, it was primal panic, like every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get away. Now! Without even thinking, I slammed on the brakes. Hard. The four-wheeler screeched, tires spitting gravel. I threw it into reverse and punched the throttle. We lurched backwards, bouncing and swerving. I didn't even look to see if Sarah was okay. I just floored it in reverse, back down Crestview Drive, as fast as that thing would go in reverse. Sarah yelled, "Paul, what the hell?" I didn't answer, couldn't answer. My throat was tight, like someone had their hands around it. I just kept looking over my shoulder, back up the hill, into the darkness, praying that thing wasn't following us. We bounced and rattled down that hill in reverse, going way too fast for that road. Branches whipped past my face. I could hear Sarah yelling again, asking what was going on. But I couldn't speak. I just needed to get away from that thing. We finally got to the bottom of Crestview Drive, back onto the flatter road. I spun the four-wheeler around and sped in the direction we came from, away from Crestview, away from whatever was up there. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I just drove as fast as I could until we were back on the main road, back towards town. Only then, when we were further away, when I could finally breathe a little, did I slow down. I pulled over to the side of the road, engine still rumbling. Sarah was still holding on tight, but she was shaking now. I could feel it. She finally said, voice trembling, "Paul, what was that? What in God's name just happened?" I turned off the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. All I could hear was my own heart pounding in my ears and my ragged breaths, and the crickets chirping like nothing was wrong, like the world hadn't just tilted on its axis. I finally managed to speak, voice hoarse and shaky. I don't know, Sarah. I honestly don't know." She looked at me, her eyes wide and dark in the dim moonlight. "You scared me to death. You nearly threw us off the four-wheeler. What did you see? You just freaked out." I took a deep breath, trying to get my bearings, trying to make sense of what I had just seen, what I had felt. Up there, on Crestview, I saw something huge. Huge? What do you mean huge? Like a deer, a bear? We're in Ohio, Paul. There aren't bears here. No, not a deer, not a bear. It was like a man, but gigantic, way bigger than a man, and dark, so dark. It was standing by that big tree, just there. I pointed back in the direction of Crestview Drive, my hands shaking. She looked at me, really looked at me. She could see the fear in my eyes, the way I was still trembling. She knew I wasn't joking. She knew I wasn't making this up. "How big, Paul?" "Really?" she asked, her voice softer now, more concerned than angry. 7, 8 feet tall, maybe more, standing up, like a shadow man, but massive and just blacker than black. I don't know how else to describe it. She was quiet for a minute, just staring at me. Then she said, Did you get a good look at it? Could you tell what it was? No, it was too dark, too sudden. I just saw the shape, the size, and I felt it. Sarah, I felt evil, just pure, cold evil coming off of it. It was terrifying. I had to get us out of there. She reached out and took my hand. Her hand was cold too. I believe you, Paul. I could see it in your face. You were genuinely terrified, but what could it have been? I shook my head. I have no idea. I have absolutely no idea. It wasn't an animal. I know animals. I've seen deer, coyotes, foxes, raccoons out here before. This was nothing like that. We sat there for a while, just holding hands, listening to the night sounds. Neither of us said anything for a long time. We were both just processing, trying to understand what had just happened. But there was nothing to understand, just fear and confusion and a lingering sense of dread. Finally, I said, Let's go home. She nodded. We got back on the four-wheeler, and I drove us straight home. We didn't talk much on the way back. The easy, happy feeling from earlier in the evening was completely gone, replaced by this cold, heavy cloud. When we got home, we went inside, locked the doors, checked the windows, even though we always do that anyway. We felt vulnerable, exposed, like whatever I'd seen on Crestview Drive could somehow follow us home, which is stupid, I know, but that's how it felt. We went to bed, but neither of us slept well. I kept seeing it in my mind, that massive dark shape just standing there in the headlights, the feeling of cold dread that had washed over me. I kept waking up in a cold sweat, heart pounding. Sarah said she had nightmares too, though she wouldn't tell me what they were about. The next morning, we were both still shaken. We were talking about it over coffee, trying to figure out what to do. Sarah was more practical. She said maybe it was just shadows playing tricks in the headlights. Maybe I'd seen a tree trunk or something and my mind had blown it out of proportion because it was dark and late and we were tired. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. What I saw, what I felt, was too real, too intense. I said to Sarah, Let's go back up there to Crestview. In the daylight, I need to see. She hesitated. I could tell she didn't really want to, but she could see I was serious. She could see I needed to know one way or another. So later that morning after breakfast, we drove back out to Crestview Drive. This time, in my truck. Broad daylight. Everything looked different in the sun. Peaceful, normal. The trees were green. The fields were golden. The sky was blue. It was hard to believe that just last night this place had felt so menacing. We drove up Crestview Drive slowly, in the truck this time. It looked different in the day. Less steep than I remembered, less isolated, still bumpy and cracked but not as scary. We got to the curve where it happened. I recognized the big oak tree immediately, the same tree. It looked just like any other oak tree in the daylight, solid, old, branches reaching out, nothing special, nothing scary. I parked the truck on the side of the road, right where I thought we'd been when I saw it. We both got out looking around. Everything looked ordinary, too ordinary, like last night had been a bad dream. See, Sarah said, trying to sound cheerful, just trees and bushes, nothing here. But I wasn't convinced. I started walking towards the oak tree, into the woods on the side of the road. Sarah followed behind me, a little hesitantly. The woods were typical woods. Leaves on the ground, sunlight filtering through the branches, birds chirping, nothing out of the ordinary. But I kept looking, searching. I was looking for something, anything, to confirm what I'd seen or to prove I'd just imagined it all. Then I saw them. On the ground, near the base of the oak tree, right where I remembered seeing that thing. Footprints, but not normal footprints. These were big, really big, and indistinct, like they were made by something heavy, something that had pressed into the soft dirt and leaves, but not clearly defined, not like shoe prints or animal tracks. They were just depressions in the ground, but huge, way too big for human feet. I pointed them out to Sarah. She came closer, and her eyes widened. What are those?" she whispered. I knelt down, examining them. They were deep, maybe an inch or two deep into the dirt, and long, like maybe 15, 16 inches long, maybe even bigger. I tried to compare my own shoe size to them, but it was ridiculous. My boots were dwarfed by these impressions, and there were several of them scattered around the base of the oak tree, like something heavy had been standing there, moving around a little bit. Not a trail of footprints, just pressure marks in the ground. "I don't know," I said, my voice low, "but look at the size of these. These aren't animal tracks, not deer, not coyote, not anything I recognize." Sarah was looking around now, her eyes scanning the woods, looking nervous again. Maybe it was a bear, a really big bear, and the footprints, they got smudged or something. "Sarah," I said, standing up, "bears don't leave footprints like this, and bears don't stand upright like a man, and bears aren't pure black void." She didn't say anything. She just looked at the footprints, then back up at the oak tree, then out at the woods around us. The sunshine didn't feel so warm anymore. The birdsong didn't sound so cheerful. We stayed there for a little while longer, just looking at the footprints, trying to make sense of them, trying to come up with any explanation, any rational explanation for what I had seen, for these massive, indistinct marks on the ground. But we couldn't. There was no explanation, nothing that made sense. Eventually, we just left. We got back in the truck and drove home. We didn't talk much on the way back again. We were both just quiet, thinking, trying not to think. We never went back to Crestview Drive after that. Not at night, not even in the day. We sold the four-wheeler a few months later, just couldn't stand to look at it anymore. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know what those footprints were. I've tried to rationalize it, to explain it away, to tell myself it was just shadows and my imagination. But I can't. I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And sometimes late at night when it's really dark and quiet, I still think about it. I still see that massive dark shape in my mind, and I still get that same cold, prickling fear in the pit of my stomach. It's been years, but I'll never forget it. And I still have absolutely no idea what it was. No idea at all. Story 7. It was late August 2019. Dad and I were coming back from visiting my Aunt Carol down in Cincinnati. We took County Road 9 because it's usually a bit faster than the interstate at that time of day. Less traffic heading north, you know. It was getting late afternoon. Sun was starting to dip a little, but it was still bright, still that late summer kind of heat lingering in the air. We were maybe an hour or so from home, just cruising, windows down, classic rock station playing on the radio, just regular stuff. Dad was driving, and I was in the passenger seat messing with my phone, though honestly, reception out there is spotty at best. We were heading towards the Clear Creek exit. There's this little dip in the road, kind of like a shallow hill, as you approach that exit ramp. We started going down that hill, and that's when we both saw it at the same time. I mean, Dad and I, we didn't say anything at first, but I know we both saw it together because later, when we talked about it, our descriptions were almost exactly the same. It was standing on the side of the road, right near the tree line, maybe, I don't know, 200, maybe 300 yards ahead of us when we first spotted it. We were still moving pretty fast then. The speed limit's 55 there. My first thought, And I swear this was instant, before I even really processed what I was seeing, was just, what the hell is that? It was brown. Completely uniformly brown, like every shade of brown you could imagine, all blended together, but just brown. And it was big, really big, bigger than a person, bigger than any person I've ever seen, and my dad is a pretty big guy himself, and it was standing upright, totally on two legs, bipedal, like you see in nature shows, but not like anything I'd ever seen on a nature show. It was just there, by the side of the road, standing straight up like it was waiting for a bus or something, except there are no bus stops out there, not even close. We kept driving closer, and I was starting to really freak out inside, though I don't think I showed it much. I sort of froze, staring. Dad, I could tell he was focused on it too. His hands tightened on the wheel a bit. It didn't move. It just stood there. Cars were passing in the other direction, going towards Lancaster, and nobody seemed to be slowing down or anything. It's like we were the only ones who could see it. Or maybe everyone else was just ignoring it, pretending it wasn't there. But how could you ignore something like that? As we got closer, maybe within 100 yards, I started trying to figure out what kind of animal it was, because my brain was still trying to make sense of it, Like, okay, it's big, it's brown, it's standing up, maybe it's a bear. But bears don't just stand around like that by the side of the road in broad daylight. And bears aren't that uniformly brown, and usually they're hairier. This thing was, well, it was hard to tell exactly what the surface was. It wasn't smooth, but it wasn't really furry either. It was almost shaggy, like really thick, matted down shagginess, but all brown. I remember thinking it looks like, and I know this sounds crazy now, but in the moment the best thing I could think of, the closest comparison in my head was Cousin It from the Addams Family. But like a giant, real-life, horrifying version of Cousin It. That's honestly the first image that popped into my head, and it stuck there. It was that shapeless, kind of bulky look, all one color, like everything was just draped in brown stuff. You couldn't see any features, no face, no neck, no shoulders really, just this huge, brown, upright mass. And it was tall, definitely taller than my dad, and he's over 6 feet. I'd say this thing was at least 7, maybe 8 feet tall. It was seriously imposing just standing there, and it was just standing, completely still, except for, well, I think I saw it kind of shift its weight once, just subtly, like it was just hanging out, waiting. And that was what was so unsettling, that it didn't seem bothered by the traffic at all. Cars and trucks were whizzing by on the road, horns honking occasionally, engine noise, everything, and this thing was just there. Like it was part of the scenery, but obviously, it wasn't. We were getting closer, maybe 50 yards now, and I could feel my heart starting to pound. I remember swallowing hard, and my mouth went dry. I glanced over at Dad. He was pale, his eyes fixed straight ahead, gripping the steering wheel tight. He still hadn't said anything. I think we were both in shock. I was trying to tell myself there was some rational explanation. Maybe it was some kind of weird scarecrow. But who puts an 8-foot-tall, completely brown scarecrow by the side of a highway? And it didn't look like a scarecrow up close. It had a solidity to it, a weight. It was clearly a 3-dimensional thing, not just some flat costume or prop. Then, just as we were getting really close, like maybe 30 yards away, and I was trying to brace myself for, I don't even know what I was bracing for, maybe it to suddenly charge at us or something, it just moved. But it didn't run. It didn't jump. It didn't even seem to hurry. It just turned. It turned its whole body, sort of smoothly and deliberately, like it knew exactly where it was going. And it just walked right into the woods, into the thick trees and underbrush at the side of the road. No sound, no rustling of leaves, nothing. It just disappeared, just stepped off the side of the road and vanished. 1 second it was there, this massive brown thing, and the next second, gone, like it had just melted into the trees. It was so dense there, the woods. Especially in late summer, everything was overgrown and thick with leaves. But still, for something that big to just disappear like that, it didn't make any sense. We drove past the spot where it had been standing. Dad slowed down a little like he was thinking of stopping, but then he just kept going. We didn't say anything for a good couple of minutes, maybe longer. The radio was still playing, some upbeat song, and it felt so incredibly out of sync with what we had just seen. Like the world was supposed to be normal and sunny and carefree. But we knew it wasn't. Something was very, very wrong. Finally, Dad spoke, his voice kind of quiet and strained. Did you see that? I just nodded, still kind of numb. Yeah, I saw it. What was that, Lisa? He sounded genuinely bewildered, like he was asking me to explain it, even though he knew I had no idea. I shook my head. I don't know, Dad. I have no idea. It wasn't an animal, was it? He thought for a moment, still looking straight ahead at the road. No, it wasn't any animal I've ever seen or heard of. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a bear. Not a cow or horse or anything like that. It wasn't human either. No, I agreed. Definitely not human. But it was bipedal. That's what kept sticking in my head. It was walking on two legs like a person, but it wasn't a person. It was brown, Dad said, like he was still trying to grasp the simplest detail. Just completely brown. Yeah, I said, like Cousin It. I couldn't get that image out of my head. He looked at me quickly, a surprised look on his face. Cousin It? You thought, yeah, I guess kind of, except huge and real, way too real. We drove in silence again for a while. We were past the Clear Creek exit now, heading north towards home. The sun was getting lower, the shadows were getting longer. The trees lining the road started to look different, darker, more menacing somehow. Everything felt off. Hunting season is still closed, isn't it? I asked, breaking the silence again. Yeah, Dad said. Doesn't open until late September for deer. And, well, there's no hunting season for whatever that was. He tried to make a little joke out of it, but it fell flat. There was no humor in it. We talked about it for the rest of the drive home, going over and over what we'd seen, trying to make sense of it, and failing completely. We considered all the logical explanations we could think of, and none of them fit. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't an animal costume. It wasn't a hallucination because we both saw it, clearly and at the same time. And it was broad daylight. We weren't tired or stressed or anything, just driving home after a normal visit with family. When we got home, we looked up local wildlife, pictures of Ohio animals, trying to see if there was anything that even remotely resembled what we had seen. We looked at bears, deer, even weird things like coyotes and bobcats, even birds, anything brown. Nothing, absolutely nothing. Dad even checked online just in case. He searched for weird sightings Ohio, unidentified animals Riverton County, stuff like that. Found a bunch of the usual crackpot stuff, Bigfoot sightings, UFO reports, but nothing specific to what we saw. Nothing that sounded even close to a giant brown Cousin It thing by the side of County Road 9. We didn't tell anyone about it for a while. We felt foolish, I guess. Like people would think we were crazy, or that we'd imagined it or made it up. But we knew what we'd seen. We knew it was real. Finally, after a couple of weeks, I told my friend Sarah she's always been interested in weird stuff, mysteries and unexplained things. I told her the whole story, and she actually listened. She didn't laugh or dismiss it. She was fascinated, actually. She's the one who told me about these online forums where people share stories like this, real-life weird experiences. That's why I'm writing this now. It's been years now, and I still think about it. All the time. Driving down any road near woods now, especially in that area, I always find myself looking, scanning the trees, expecting, I don't even know what. To see it again, maybe? Or something else just as strange? We never went back to that exact spot, not intentionally anyway. We avoid County Road 9 now if we can. It's not a phobia or anything, it's unsettling to drive there. It brings back that feeling, that icy dread, that sense that something completely unnatural is out there, lurking just beyond the edge of what we know. I still have no explanation for it, to this day. And that's the worst part, I think, the not knowing, the feeling that we saw something we weren't supposed to see, something that shouldn't exist, and it was just there, for us to see. And then it was just gone. Like a ghost or something even stranger. I just wish I knew what it was, or if anyone else has ever seen anything like it. Because sometimes, late at night, I lie awake and wonder, what if it's still out there in those woods? Just waiting. Story 8. Man, I don't even know where to start with this. It's still messing with me days later. I went out to Willow Creek Lake last Saturday. I do this every year around this time, end of September, early October, because that's usually when the pawpaws are ripe. Last year was insane. I found this patch just loaded with them. I mean, it was like hitting the lottery for pawpaws. I froze a bunch, made some smoothies, even gave some to my neighbors, and still had more than I knew what to do with. So, yeah, I was hoping to repeat that success. I got there around maybe 10 in the morning. It was a pretty nice day, bit cooler than it had been, but sunny, you know, that crisp fall air, perfect for being in the woods. I parked in the usual spot, which is this little gravel pull-off area right by the trailhead. Willow Creek Lake isn't super popular. It's kind of out of the way in Clay County, but it's pretty, and there are some decent hiking trails. I like getting out there to just chill and obviously hunt for pawpaws, so I hiked in, maybe a mile or so, to where I found that killer patch last year. And nothing. Seriously, nothing. I walked around, looked under all the pawpaw trees in the area, and nada. Not a single ripe pawpaw. A few green ones still hanging, but that was it. I was so bummed. I mean, seriously disappointed. I'd been looking forward to this for weeks. I started thinking maybe I was too late this year, or maybe the weather messed things up, or, I don't know, maybe someone else got to them first, like I thought walking back. That was the only logical thing, right? Someone else just beat me to the punch. Anyway, after about an hour of wandering around and finding absolutely nothing, I just gave up. Dejected is the word, I guess. I felt deflated. I turned around and started heading back to the car, kicking at leaves on the trail, just feeling kind of irritated that my pawpaw trip was a bust. I was almost back to the parking area. I could see my car through the trees. And then I heard it. This rustling. Not like wind rustling or just normal leaves falling. This was different. It was a definite rhythmic rustling sound coming from deeper in the woods, maybe 10, 15 yards off the trail, kind of behind where I'd parked, towards this thicker section of trees. My first thought was just a deer. Deer make a lot of noise in the woods sometimes, crashing through stuff. Or maybe a turkey or something, kicking around in the leaves. But this rustling, it was almost too heavy for that, if that makes sense. And it wasn't like crashing, it was more like deliberate movements, like something was actively pushing through the undergrowth. I stopped walking and turned towards the sound. I was expecting to see a bird fly up, maybe a big crow or something taking off from the ground, or like I said, a deer just walking by. But there was nothing, just trees, thick woods, fall leaves starting to turn colors, you know, pretty typical wood scene, except for this rustling sound. It kept going, steady, but I couldn't see anything moving on the ground. Then I saw it. About 6 feet off the ground, maybe a little higher, this tree branch started moving. A pretty thick branch on an oak tree. It wasn't swaying like it was windy because there was hardly any wind that day. This branch was moving, up and down, and a little back and forth, almost like something was shaking it, or like trying to bend it. I stared at it. I mean, really stared, trying to figure out what was going on. I still couldn't see any birds. No squirrels, no raccoons climbing on it, nothing that would explain why this branch was moving like that. It was just moving on its own, or so it seemed. I started to think, okay, maybe a squirrel is on the other side of the tree, or maybe some bigger animal like a bobcat climbed up and was messing with the branches, but then why would just one branch be moving like that and nothing else? It didn't make sense. I started to feel this little prickle of unease, like something wasn't right. This wasn't normal wood sounds or movements. It felt off. My mind started racing a bit. What could be making that branch move like that? I circled around my car to get a better view of the base of the oak tree where the branch was moving. I figured if it was an animal, I'd see it if I just changed my angle. I walked slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on the tree. The rustling had stopped by now, but the branch was still subtly moving, almost vibrating a little bit, and then I saw it, just a glimpse. Behind the trunk of the oak tree, this huge, thick oak tree, I saw something dark. Black. It moved quickly. It was like a head. A big black head, just for a split second. It ducked back behind the tree trunk, disappearing completely from view. I froze. I was absolutely rooted to the spot. My heart started pounding in my chest like it wanted to jump out. Boom, boom, boom. I could feel it thumping in my ears. I just stood there, staring at that oak tree, waiting, trying to see if it would reappear, trying to make sense of what I just saw. A black head. Behind a tree trunk, it was big, definitely bigger than a dog, bigger than a deer's head, and it was black, completely black as far as I could tell. No fur, no features that I could make out in that split second. Just blackness. And it moved quickly like it didn't want to be seen. For a few seconds it was silent, completely silent. No rustling, no branch moving, no birds chirping, nothing. Just quiet. Too quiet almost. And I'm standing there staring at this oak tree with my heart pounding in my chest, and this wave of unease just washes over me. Not just unease, fear. Yeah, straight up fear. My mind went completely blank for a second. Then it started going into overdrive. Okay, what was that? What did I just see? Was it an animal, a bear? We get bears around here sometimes, but this didn't feel like a bear. Bears are usually brown, and they're not exactly stealthy. And they don't hide behind tree trunks like that, do they? Plus it was black, solid black, and huge. Then another thought flashed through my mind, and I know how crazy this sounds, but it was the first thing that actually felt right. Felt like it fit the weirdness of what I'd just witnessed. Bigfoot. I know. Bigfoot. It sounds ridiculous even to me. I've never been one to believe in all that cryptozoology stuff. But what else could it have been? A big, black, unseen creature hiding in the woods, moving branches and then ducking behind a tree. It fit the description, you know. The stories you hear, the sightings, the whole legend thing, and suddenly it clicked. The pawpaws. Someone must have gotten here first, I'd thought earlier, feeling annoyed about missing out. But what if it wasn't someone? What if it was something else? Something that lived out here in these woods and ate pawpaws? It was pawpaw season after all. Maybe that patch I found last year wasn't just luck. Maybe I was sharing it with something else, something that didn't want to be shared with this year. The rustling leaves and moving tree branch, that wasn't just random. That was it. That was it. It was there, right there, just yards away from me, hidden, watching, and I had just seen it, or part of it anyway. A jolt of pure, primal fear shot through me. Not the kind of fear you get from watching a scary movie. This was different. This was real fear. Fear for my safety. Fear of the unknown. Fear of something out there in the woods that I didn't understand. Something big and black and hidden and potentially dangerous. Instinct just took over. My brain went into pure survival mode. I didn't even think. I just knew I had to get out of there now. Immediately, I didn't want to stick around and investigate. I didn't want to get a closer look. I didn't want to take any chances. Whatever that thing was, I wanted to be as far away from it as possible, as quickly as possible. I turned and practically ran back to my car, fumbled with my keys, got the door unlocked and practically threw myself inside, locked the doors instantly, started the engine, put it in reverse and just got out of there. Tires spitting gravel, I didn't care. I just wanted to be gone, away from those woods, away from that tree, away from whatever was hiding behind it. I didn't look back. I didn't check my rearview mirror. I just drove, fast. Down the gravel road, back to the main road, and then onto the highway. I didn't slow down until I was miles away, back in town, back in familiar territory, back where things felt normal, or at least where they felt safe. Even then, driving home, my hands were still shaking on the steering wheel. My heart was still racing. I kept looking in my mirrors, even though I knew, rationally, that whatever it wasn't going to chase me. But the fear, it was still there, lingering, clinging to me like a shadow. I haven't been able to shake it off. I keep replaying it in my head, the rustling, the branch moving, the black head behind the tree, just that fleeting glimpse. And that feeling, that overwhelming feeling of unease and fear. I haven't told many people about this. My wife would think I'm nuts. My friends would probably laugh. But I know what I saw, or I think I do. I saw something real, something I can't explain, and it scared the living daylights out of me. I'm not going back to Willow Creek Lake anytime soon. Definitely not for pawpaws. Maybe never. I don't know. I just know that something is out there in those woods, something big and dark and unseen, and I had a very, very close call. I still get chills thinking about it. That black head, just disappearing behind that tree, like it was never there. But it was. I know it was. And that's enough to keep me away from those woods for a long, long time. Maybe forever. I just can't explain what I saw. And honestly, I don't think I ever will. It's just out there. And that's the part that really gets to me, the not knowing, the unexplained, just gone. Story 9. It was way back in '51, Oak Haven, California. You wouldn't know Oak Haven unless you grew up there, maybe not even then. It was just fields, really. Dirt roads, the kind that dust billowed up like smoke behind your dad's old Ford. We lived on the edge of town, if you could even call it a town. More like a few houses scattered around a general store and a gas station. Back then, things were different. You knew your neighbors, mostly because there weren't many to know. Mr. Peterson was one of them. Lived on the next property over, had a chicken ranch, a small one, and a lemon orchard that stretched further than I could see as a kid. I was just a kid then, maybe 7 or 8. Kids ran wild back then. No one kept you inside unless it was supper time. I spent most days outdoors, exploring, getting into trouble. One afternoon, I was near Peterson's ranch, poking around in the fields between our places. I saw Mr. Peterson out by the edge of his property, near the old oak tree that everyone said was older than the town itself. He was doing something, looked like he was digging. I got closer, just being a kid, curious. He was butchering a cow, right there in the field. I'd seen chickens get their heads chopped off before. Everyone on a ranch did. But a cow? That was different. It was big and it looked sad even after it was gone. Mr. Peterson was all business, though. Strong man, Mr. Peterson. He was cutting parts off, the bits you couldn't eat, I guess, and piling them up on a tarp. Then he dragged them over to a hole he'd dug by the big oak. He dumped the parts in, guts and stuff, I guess. I didn't want to look too close, and started shoveling dirt back in, just like that, burying it right there. Felt a little weird, even to a kid. But Mr. Peterson was a grown-up. He knew what he was doing. I watched for a bit, then got bored and went off to play somewhere else. Kids' attention spans, you know? Later that day, after supper, My brother Mikey and some kids from down the road, Jimmy and Sarah, came over. We were going to play hide and seek, the usual kid stuff. It was getting dark, that kind of twilight where everything goes blue and shadowy, perfect for hiding. Mikey was it first. We all scattered. I ran towards the edge of our property, closer to Peterson's place again, without even thinking about it. Guess my mind was still on what I'd seen earlier. I was looking for a good spot, somewhere no one would find me right away. I saw this thick patch of bushes, real dense, right near the property line, not too far from that old oak tree. Seemed perfect. I ducked down and crawled into the bushes, pushing my way through the branches. It was darker in there, smelled earthy and a little damp. I settled down, trying to be quiet, listening for Mikey yelling, "Ready or not, here I come." That's when I heard it. A sound, not Mikey, not the other kids. Different. It was steps, but heavy. Not like normal footsteps, more like shuffling and slow. Heavy shuffling, like someone really big was walking and their feet were dragging a little, like they were wearing slippers, those soft kind. Thump, scuff, thump, scuff. That's what it sounded like, getting closer. And with the steps, there was another sound, lower, deeper, like grunting. Low grunts like an animal, but heavier somehow, and sniffing sounds, like someone was trying to smell something, real deep sniffs. My heart started to pound, not in a fun hide-and-seek way. This was different. This was cold. Fear started creeping in, like ice water running down my back. I froze, holding my breath, not wanting to make a sound, just listening. The shuffling and grunting were getting closer, definitely coming towards the bushes where I was hiding. The bushes rustled a little, right in front of me, like something was pushing through them, slow and careful. I squeezed my eyes shut for a second, then opened them again, peeking through the leaves, and then I saw it, just a face at first, right there. In the bushes a few feet away, big face, fuzzy, brownish-reddish fur, all matted and thick, and the nose flat, not like a dog or a cat nose, flatter, wider, like a pig's snout almost, but furrier, and the eyes black, just black, staring right at me. But not just black, there was something gold in them, shining in the dark like flecks of gold deep inside the black, reflecting the little bit of moonlight that was filtering through the leaves, and the teeth, yellowish and big, especially two of them in the front, sticking out, incisors I guess you'd call them now, big yellow rabbit-like teeth, but on this face, the expression, that's what I remember most, I think. Not angry, not mean, just confused, like it was looking at something it didn't understand, like I was the weird thing. It was just staring. I was staring back, frozen, couldn't breathe, couldn't move, just staring into those black gold eyes. Time stopped, felt like forever, just looking at that face in the bushes. The air was thick with something, musky, animal, but stronger, not like the cows or chickens we had, wilder. Then it lifted its hands. At least they looked like hands. Big and furry, with long fingers, pushing the branches aside, gently almost, like it wanted to see me better. Or maybe it was curious too, just as scared as I was. I don't know. But it was parting the branches, making the opening bigger just to get a better look. That moment, when those furry hands parted the leaves and I saw more of it, it's burned into my brain, because then I saw the rest of it. It wasn't just a face, it was huge. It stood up slowly, pushing the branches further apart, rising up out of the bushes, big, hairy body, covered in the same brownish-red fur, long arms, reaching down almost to its knees, much, much taller than my dad, taller than Mr. Peterson, taller than anyone I knew. It straightened up, and it was massive. Looming over the bushes, it looked down at me again, still staring, same confused look. Then it made a sound, a low sound deep in its chest, a moan, not like a hurt moan, more like a sad moan, or maybe a curious moan, I don't know how to describe it. A deep, rumbling moan. Ooh! Right then, from further away, I heard Mikey yelling, "Timmy! Timmy, where are you?" And then the dog, ours, Buster, started barking, loud, sharp barks coming closer. The sound of Mikey's voice and Buster barking, it broke the spell. For both of us, I think. The creature, it seemed to flinch a little at the noise, like it didn't like loud sounds. It looked towards the sound, head tilting a bit, still confused. Then it looked back at me one last time, black gold eyes staring into mine, that moan again, deeper this time. Ooh. And then it turned, just turned, slow and heavy, and stepped back into the deeper shadows beyond the bushes, away from the sounds of Mikey and Buster, away from me. I heard more shuffling steps, going away, deeper into Peterson's orchard, fading into the night. I didn't move, couldn't move, just stayed there, crouched in the bushes, heart still pounding like a drum, listened as the shuffling got fainter, until it was gone. Silence again. Except for Mikey still yelling my name and Buster barking closer now. Finally, I could move. Crawled out of the bushes, shaking. Legs felt like jelly. I stumbled out and ran as fast as I could, back towards our house, towards the sound of Mikey's voice, towards Buster's barking. Ran until I burst out of the trees and into our backyard, into the dim light from the porch. Mikey and Jimmy and Sarah were there, looking around, worried. Buster was running in circles, barking at the bushes like he smelled something. "Timmy, where were you? We've been calling you!" Mikey yelled, annoyed and relieved at the same time. I couldn't talk at first. Just stood there, gasping for breath, pointing back towards the bushes, towards Peterson's property. There was something in the bushes. I finally managed to get out, voice shaking. "Something? What something?" Jimmy asked, coming closer. Sarah looked scared already, just seeing my face, I guess. I tried to tell them about the shuffling steps, the grunts, the smell, the face, the eyes, the teeth, the big furry body, about how tall it was, how it looked at me. I told them everything as best as I could, everything I saw, everything I heard, everything I felt. The fear, the cold, the staring. They just looked at me. Mikey frowned. Jimmy snickered a little. Sarah just looked scared and confused. "You're making it up," Mikey said finally. "There's nothing in the bushes." "I saw it. I really did. It was big, hairy. It looked right at me," I insisted, tears starting to well up in my eyes. I knew what I saw. I knew it was real. "Probably just a bear," Jimmy said, trying to sound brave, but he looked a bit nervous too now. "Maybe a bear wandered down from the hills." "Bears don't have faces like that," I mumbled, "and they don't make that sound." I tried to imitate the moan, the deep rumble in the chest, but it didn't sound the same coming from me. It sounded silly. "Come on, Timmy's just trying to scare us," Mikey said, shaking his head. "Let's just go inside. It's getting late." They all started walking towards the house. Sarah was holding onto Jimmy's arm. Mikey looked back at me, a little bit of doubt in his eyes maybe, but mostly just impatience. I followed them, still shaking, still seeing that face in my head. My parents were inside in the kitchen. Mom was making sandwiches for lunch tomorrow. Dad was reading the newspaper. They looked up when we came in. "What's all the commotion?" Dad asked, putting down his paper. Mikey told them we were just playing hide and seek. Nothing happened, but I couldn't keep quiet. I had to tell someone. I blurted it out, about the creature in the bushes. Everything I told Mikey and the others, I told them too. Mom stopped making sandwiches and looked at me, eyes wide. Dad frowned, putting his paper down completely now, looking serious. "What are you talking about, Timmy?" he asked, his voice low. I told it again, slower this time, trying to explain it better, about the shuffling steps, the grunts, the smell, the face, the eyes, the teeth, the size, about the fear, the stare, the moan, the way it just left. They listened. Mom's face got paler and paler. Dad kept frowning, listening intently, not interrupting. When I finished, there was silence in the kitchen, only the ticking of the kitchen clock. Then Dad sighed, a long, heavy sigh. He looked at Mom, then back at me. "Timmy," he said, his voice gentle, "you know there are no such things as monsters, right?" "But I saw it, Dad, I really did. It was right there," I pleaded, tears threatening to spill over. "Honey," Mom said softly, coming over and putting her arm around me, "you probably just saw a shadow, or maybe a big dog. Sometimes shadows play tricks on your eyes, especially when it's getting dark. It wasn't a dog, Mom. It was bigger than a dog, bigger than anything, and it wasn't a shadow. I saw its face. I saw its eyes. It was real." Dad stood up and came over to us. He put a hand on my shoulder. "All right, son," he said, "let's go take a look. Show me where you saw this, thing." He grabbed a flashlight from the drawer, and we all went outside. Mikey, Jimmy, and Sarah followed us, looking curious now, a little less sure of themselves. Buster trotted along beside us, tail wagging, probably thinking we were going for a walk. We walked to the edge of our property, towards the bushes. Dad shined the flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut through the trees, illuminating the bushes where I'd hidden. Everything looked normal, just bushes, shadows moving in the breeze, nothing else. Dad pushed aside the branches, shining the light inside, empty, just leaves and twigs and dirt, nothing there. He looked at me, his eyes asking. "It was right there, Dad. Right in there," I whispered, pointing into the bushes. My voice sounded small and unsure now, even to me. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just shadows playing tricks. But I knew what I saw. I knew what I heard. I knew how scared I was. That wasn't a shadow. That wasn't my imagination. It was real. Something real was in those bushes. Dad searched around for a few minutes, shining the flashlight everywhere. Under the bushes, behind the trees, along the property line. Nothing. No footprints. No broken branches. Nothing to show that anything big had been there. He sighed again. "See, Timmy," he said gently. "There's nothing here. It was just your imagination, son. You got scared, playing in the dark. It happens." He put his arm around me again, and we walked back to the house. Mom hugged me tight, said it was okay, just a bad dream while I was awake. Mikey, Jimmy, and Sarah looked at each other, a little smug, a little relieved. They probably thought I was just a scaredy cat, but I knew. Deep down, I knew. I saw what I saw, and I'll never forget it. That face in the bushes, those black gold eyes, that deep moan, the feeling of something else, something not normal. To this day, I still can't explain it. Never told anyone about it again, really. They'd just laugh, think I was crazy, or a kid with too much imagination. But I know what happened that night in Oakhaven, and sometimes late at night when it's quiet, I still hear those shuffling steps in my head, and that low, sad moan, and I see those black gold eyes staring at me from the darkness. I don't know what it was, and I probably never will, but whatever it was out there, in the bushes, in the dark, watching me. And I was watching it back, and that's all I know. It just happened, and then it was gone. See, story 10. It was back in 60-something, must have been December because it was cold, real cold for California, you know. We lived in Oakhaven, kind of out in the sticks even back then, avocado ranches and empty land mostly. Me and my cousins, Peter was one, always getting into trouble, especially when we were bored, which was pretty much always after school let out and on weekends. There was this old farmhouse not too far from Peto's place, right near this big avocado ranch, just sitting there empty. No one lived there for years, probably longer. It was falling apart, paint peeling, windows broken out, the whole 9 yards. For us, it was perfect. We were watching way too much TV back then, all those cowboy shows. paladin, bonanza, you name it. We got this idea to make the farmhouse our fort, like outlaws or something. Dumb kid stuff. We'd sneak over there whenever we could, mostly after it got dark, 'cause it felt spookier that way. We'd swipe candles from our houses. Yeah, we were little thieves, to light up inside. It was all dusty and smelled like old wood and dirt, but we didn't care. We'd light those candles and stick them in empty cans we found. And the shadows they made inside that old place? Man, they were creepy as hell. We'd scare each other on purpose, jumping out from behind corners, making ghost noises, typical kid games. We thought we were so tough. This one night, it was darker than usual, even for December. No moon, I guess. We were in the farmhouse, Pito, me. They called me Hoss back then, don't even ask. My other cousins, Sam and Tommy, all of us messing around. We had these flickering candles all over the place, making those crazy shadows dance on the walls. We were acting all brave, telling stupid, scary stories and trying to one-up each other, like always. Then we heard it, just a sound from outside. At first it was faint, almost like the wind, but not really. It was heavier. We all froze, even Tommy, who was usually the biggest show-off. We stopped talking, stopped breathing loud, just listening. The shadows from the candles seemed to stretch and move even more in the silence, making everything look even weirder. Pito, he was always the cautious one, held up his hand. "Shh," he whispered, like we were about to spook a deer or something. We stood still as statues. That's when we saw it, the shadow on the window, not inside like one of ours, but outside. A huge shadow. It wasn't just any shadow either. It was big, like really big. And it moved slow and heavy. My first thought, stupidly, was maybe it was my dad. He was a big guy, but this shadow was different. It was way too tall, way too thick. Even in the dim candlelight reflecting off the dirty window, it was obvious this wasn't no person I knew. We all stared at the window, eyes wide open. Nobody said a word. We were huddled together, our little cowboy game completely forgotten. The shadow moved again, a slow, lumbering movement, and we could see it was getting closer to the front of the house. Then Tommy, who was scared but trying not to show it, mumbled, "Maybe it's Earl." Earl was this older kid from down the road, a real bully. He loved picking on us little kids. Sometimes he'd follow us and try to scare us. For some reason, in our dumb kid brains, that huge looming shadow suddenly made sense as being Earl. Yeah, Earl, who was maybe 5'0", suddenly became this giant shadow monster outside our fort. Kids, right? Pito, always the planner, his eyes went all squinty. "Let's get him," he said, his voice shaking a little but trying to sound tough. "We'll jump him when he comes to the door." "Yeah!" Sam piped up a little too loud, trying to match Pito's bravado. Tommy just nodded, looking pale in the candlelight. Me, I was just following along, scared but also kind of excited to finally get back at Earl for all the times he'd pushed us around. So we huddled by the back door, which was half hanging off its hinges, planning our big ambush. The shadow was moving towards the front door now. We could hear footsteps, heavy ones, crunching on the dried weeds outside. This was it, our big moment. Pito nodded, a quick, jerky movement. "Ready? Now!" We burst out the back door like a bunch of lunatics, yelling and screaming, waving our arms around like we were charging into battle. "Get him! Get Earl!" We were shouting, stupid kid battle cries echoing in the cold night air. We ran around the side of the house towards the front, ready to jump out and scare the pants off of Earl, show him we weren't afraid anymore. Except it wasn't Earl. Not even close. Standing in front of the farmhouse door, blocking out most of the light from the stupid candles inside, was something else. Something that made Earl look like a friendly puppy. It was huge. Just absolutely enormous, way bigger than any man, any animal I'd ever seen. It was standing upright but hunched over a bit, like it was too tall for its own good. And it was covered in hair, not neat fur, but thick, shaggy hair, like a wild animal, but standing like a man. I don't even know how to describe what it looked like in that split second before everything went to hell. It was dark, almost black in the dim light, and it seemed to blend in with the shadows, but it was solid, real. And those eyes, I just caught a glimpse, but they were glowing, reflecting the candlelight somehow, like animal eyes in the headlights. They were big and hungry looking. It wasn't wearing Earl's worn-out jacket, that's for sure. It looked like it was wearing some kind of pelt, something rough and dark, hanging off its massive shoulders. And its legs, they were thick like tree trunks, covered in that same matted hair, ending in feet that I couldn't really see in the dark, but I knew were huge. We froze, our yelling dying in our throats. The brave cowboy act vanished in an instant, replaced by pure, gut-wrenching terror. Tommy and Sam, they didn't even hesitate. They turned and ran, screaming for real this time, heading back towards Pito's place, legs pumping like they were trying to outrun a nightmare. I was stuck. My feet wouldn't move. I was just staring up at this thing, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I remember grabbing onto Pito's shirt sleeve, just clutching it tight, like he was the only thing keeping me from floating away. Pito was frozen too, but he didn't run. He was just staring, eyes wide, his face white in the faint light. We were both paralyzed, staring up at this monster. And then it made a sound. It wasn't a shout, not a yell, not anything human. It was a roar, but deeper, something guttural, like it was coming from deep inside the earth. It was deafening, like a wild animal, but amplified, twisted into something truly terrifying. It vibrated in my chest, making my teeth chatter. I can still hear that sound sometimes, in my dreams. That roar broke whatever spell had held us. Pito yanked me backwards, hard, pulling me with him. We stumbled back towards the farmhouse, scrambling to get inside, tripping over our own feet in our panic. We didn't stop running until we slammed into the back wall of the house, practically falling through the broken door we'd just run out of. We didn't go back to being cowboys anymore. We didn't go back to being brave. We were just two scared little boys, huddled together in the dust and darkness trying to breathe. We didn't dare light any more candles. We stayed in the pitch black inside the farmhouse, just listening. We could still hear it outside. It was moving around. We could hear heavy footsteps circling the house like it was looking for us. And it kept making sounds. Not that roar again, not yet, but deep, guttural growls, hisses, almost like it was talking to itself, or maybe to us, in a language we couldn't understand and didn't want to. I was shaking so bad I could barely stand. Pito was too. We huddled under the rickety wooden staircase inside the house, squeezing ourselves into the space under the bottom steps, trying to make ourselves as small and invisible as possible. It was dusty and cramped under there, spiderwebs all over the place, but we didn't care. We just wanted to hide. Time seemed to stop. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of leaves outside, every snap of a twig sounded like the monster coming for us. We held our breath whenever we heard it getting closer, and then let it out in shaky gasps when it moved away. I don't know how long we were under that staircase. It felt like hours, but it could have been just minutes. It was the longest, most terrifying time of my life. I just kept thinking about those eyes, that roar, the sheer size of that thing. What was it? What did it want? Was it going to break down the door? Was it going to find us? Then, finally, we heard a different sound. A car. Headlights flashed through the broken windows, cutting through the darkness. Voices, men's voices, shouting. It was Pito's dad and his older brother, Hector. Tommy and Sam must have made it back to Pito's house and told them what happened. We scrambled out from under the stairs, blinking in the sudden light. Pito's dad, Tio Juan, burst through the back door, looking frantic, his face lit by a flashlight he was holding. Hector was right behind him, holding a rifle. A real rifle. I'd never seen a real gun up close before. Not like that. Tio Juan rushed to us, pulling us into a tight hug, checking us over. "Pito, Hoss, are you okay? What happened?" he asked, his voice rough with worry. We just pointed towards the front of the house, unable to speak, still too terrified. Tio Juan followed our gaze, then nodded to Hector, who stepped cautiously towards the front door, rifle raised. Tio Juan kept his arm around us, pulling us close as he edged towards the front window and peered out. He was there for what felt like forever, just staring out into the darkness. Then he slowly backed away, his face grim. "There's nothing there now," he said, his voice low. "Whatever it was, it's gone." But I could tell by his face, by the way he kept looking around, that he didn't really believe it was just gone. He was scared too. I could smell it on him, mixed with the smell of his cigarettes and sweat. He got us out of that farmhouse fast. Hector covered their backs with the rifle, looking nervous and scanning the darkness with his flashlight. We didn't see anything, but the feeling of being watched, of something still lurking out there that didn't go away. They practically carried us to the car, put us in the back, and drove like bats out of hell back to Pito's house. We didn't say much on the way. We were still shaking too hard to talk. Tommy and Sam were already there, wrapped in blankets, drinking hot chocolate, their faces tear-stained and pale. Nobody believed our story. Not really. Tio Juan and Hector, they were worried, sure, and they went back to the farmhouse the next day to check it out. They said they found nothing. No tracks, no signs of anything unusual, just the old, empty farmhouse, falling apart as always. They figured we'd just gotten spooked by a deer or maybe a bear. Maybe our imaginations had run wild, fueled by those stupid cowboy shows and dark shadows. But I know what I saw. Pito knows too. We don't talk about it much. Not even now. All these years later, it's just something we both carry inside, that feeling of pure, primal fear. That glimpse of something monstrous and unknown in the darkness. Sometimes late at night, when everything is quiet, I still think about that farmhouse. I think about that shadow, those eyes, that roar. And I wonder, what was it? What did we see that night? And sometimes I swear when the wind blows just right, I can almost hear that deep, guttural growl again, carried on the cold night air, and it sends a shiver right down my spine, reminding me of that terrifying December night in Oakhaven when we were just kids playing cowboy, and we stumbled onto something real, something ancient, and something monstrous. And I still have no idea what it was, or where it came from, and honestly, part of me is still terrified it might come back. Story 11. It was supposed to be a simple fishing trip, you know, just me and my buddy Dale. 1989. Florida, middle of nowhere between Oakwood and Daytona. We were always looking for good spots away from the crowds, and this river, some offshoot of the bigger one, seemed perfect, peaceful, quiet. We packed up my old Ford pickup, threw in our tent, some fishing gear, a cooler full of beer and snacks, and headed out. Neither of us were pros, just guys who liked being out in nature, casting a line, maybe catching something for dinner. We got there late afternoon, found a decent clearing near the riverbank and set up camp. Nothing fancy, a cheap tent, 2 folding chairs, a small gas stove for cooking. We even brought those 5-gallon buckets to keep our catch in, figuring we'd have enough catfish or maybe some bass to fill them. The river looked clean, and the woods around us were thick, dense Florida scrub. Sun was setting, casting long shadows, making everything look kind of orange and gold. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet where you could actually hear the insects buzzing and the river gurgling. We fished until it got dark, using lanterns. Caught a few catfish, nothing huge, but enough to feel like we were doing something right. We cleaned them by the river, the cold water feeling good on our hands even though it was still humid out. Cooked them up on the gas stove with some butter and spices Dale had brought. Simple meal, but after a day outside, it tasted like heaven. Drank a couple of beers each, sitting around the campfire we made from some fallen branches we'd gathered. Talked about work, baseball, the usual guy stuff. It was relaxing, just what we both needed. Around 11 or so, we decided to call it a night, put out the fire, double-checked the food was put away, and crawled into the tent. It was one of those cheap dome tents, nylon thin as paper, but it kept the bugs out mostly. Dale was out like a light almost immediately, snoring softly. I lay there for a while longer, just listening to the night sounds. Crickets, frogs, the rustling of leaves. It was all normal, natural. I felt good, tired but good. That kind of tired you get from being outside all day. Drifted off to sleep eventually. Then it happened. It was sudden, violent. 1 second I was asleep. The next I was bolt upright, heart hammering. It was the noise. Jesus Christ, the noise. It started as a kind of howl, deep and guttural, like nothing I'd ever heard before. Not an animal I recognized, not a dog, not a coyote, not even close. It was lower, heavier, more primal, and then it turned into screaming. Screaming like someone was being murdered, high-pitched, frantic, full of pain and rage. It was right outside the tent. My blood ran cold, literally. Every hair on my body stood on end. Dale was awake now too, sitting up, his eyes wide in the dim light filtering through the tent fabric. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't know, couldn't even begin to guess. It sounded like something in terrible agony. The screaming was so intense, so raw, it felt like it was vibrating inside my chest. It was mixed with growls and snarls now, and the sound of things being broken, crushed. "Something's out there," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Something big." We were frozen, huddled together in that flimsy tent, listening to this nightmare unfold outside. The screaming continued, but it moved now, closer to the riverbank. We heard crashing like branches snapping and heavy footsteps. Whatever it was moving around our campsite, destroying things. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Just sitting there, trapped, listening to those horrific sounds, was worse than facing whatever was making them. "I gotta see what it is," I said, my voice shaky but firm. Dale grabbed my arm. "Are you crazy? We don't know what's out there. It could be dangerous." "Yeah, well, staying in here is dangerous too," I said, pulling my arm away. "We're sitting ducks in this tent. I need to see what we're dealing with." I grabbed the flashlight that was lying next to my sleeping bag. It was a big, heavy-duty one, but it felt useless against whatever was making those sounds. I fumbled with the zipper of the tent, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get it open. Dale was right behind me now, his eyes wide with terror. I took a deep breath and pulled the tent flap open. The first thing that hit me was the sight. The campsite was bathed in moonlight, enough to see pretty clearly. And in the middle of it all, Jesus, I'll never forget it. It was huge, a massive hulking shape moving around our campsite. It was covered in thick, dark fur, almost black in the moonlight. It stood upright like a man, but it was way bigger than any man I'd ever seen. I'd say it was easily 8 or 9 feet tall, maybe even taller. It was ripping apart our campsite. The folding chairs were splintered, the cooler was flipped over, cans of beer and food scattered everywhere. Our firewood pile was kicked apart, logs flying. It moved with this raw animal power, just tearing things apart, flinging them around like they were toys. And the noise, it was still screaming, that agonizing, ear-splitting scream, mixed with roars and guttural growls. It was making a sound that I didn't even think was possible for a living thing to make. Then it went for the buckets. We had those 2 5-gallon buckets filled with the fish we'd caught. It lumbered over to them, reaching down with a massive, hairy arm. It plunged its hand into one of the buckets. I could see it clearly in the moonlight. Long, thick fingers, ending in sharp, dark claws. It grabbed a handful of fish, and then it screamed again, this time even louder, even more intense. It was like pure pain, pure rage exploding out of it. I realized why. It had grabbed not just fish, but the treble hooks we'd used to catch them. The hooks had dug into its hand. It thrashed, pulling its hand out of the bucket, fish and hooks dangling from its massive fingers. It roared again, a sound that literally hurt my ears. Dale and I both instinctively covered our ears, but it didn't help. The sound was too loud, too close. It vibrated in our bones. It sounded like a woman being tortured, like someone was ripping her apart alive, but deeper, somehow more monstrous. Then it turned towards us, slowly, deliberately. Its head, or what I assumed was its head, there wasn't really a neck, its head just seemed to sit right on top of its shoulders, turned in our direction. I couldn't see its face clearly in the shadows, but I could see glints of something pale, maybe eyes. And I knew, just knew, that it had heard us. It knew we were there. Terror, pure and absolute terror, gripped me. I'd never felt anything like it. My legs turned to jelly. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. Dale was behind me, making whimpering noises. We were trapped, exposed, facing this thing. And then, as quickly as it had turned towards us, it turned away again. It dropped the fish and hooks from its hand and lumbered off towards the woods. But not just lumbered. It ran. This massive creature running into the trees, and it was still screaming. We heard it crashing through the undergrowth, snapping branches like twigs, its screams echoing through the night. It sounded like it was getting further away, but the sounds were still incredibly loud, incredibly close. It was breaking everything in its path, tearing through the forest like a bulldozer. "Run!" I yelled at Dale, finally finding my voice. "Get to the truck!" We didn't need to be told twice. We scrambled out of the tent, not even bothering to pack anything. We just ran. We sprinted towards the pickup, fumbling for the keys. I got the door open, jumped in. Dale piled in after me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. Finally it turned. The engine roared to life. I slammed it into reverse, backed up wildly, nearly hitting a tree. Then I put it in drive and floored it, tires spinning in the dirt. We bounced down the track, heading back towards the main road, away from the river, away from the campsite, away from it. We didn't say a word for the first few minutes. We were both just shaking, panting, adrenaline coursing through our veins. The screams were still echoing in my head. Finally Dale spoke, his voice hoarse. What was that?" "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling. "I honestly have no idea." "It was huge," he said, his eyes wide, staring straight ahead. "Did you see how big it was?" "Yeah," I said, "I saw." We drove for miles, not stopping, not slowing down, until we reached the highway. Only then did we start to calm down, just a little. We drove straight to Daytona Beach, found a motel, checked in, and collapsed into our beds. We didn't talk about it anymore that night. We were both too freaked out. The next morning, we were still shaken, but a little braver maybe. Curiosity, or maybe just plain stupidity, got the better of us. We had left everything at the campsite, our tent, our gear, everything. We couldn't just leave it all behind. We had to go back. "Are you sure about this?" Dale asked, as we drove back towards the river in the daylight. The sun was shining, birds were singing. It seemed impossible that the horrors of the night before had actually happened in this peaceful place. "We got to get our stuff," I said, "and I need to see if I really saw what I think I saw." We drove back down the track, slowly this time, our hearts pounding in our chests again. When we reached the clearing where our campsite had been, we stopped. It was a disaster. Everything was smashed, broken, torn apart. The tent was ripped to shreds. The chairs were in pieces. The cooler was overturned, empty cans and food scattered everywhere. It looked like a tornado had hit our little campsite. And then we saw the tracks, massive footprints in the sand near the riverbank. Huge three-toed tracks, easily 18 inches long, maybe even longer. Deep impressions in the sand. They led from the river right through our campsite and then back into the woods. They were unmistakable. Nothing human, nothing animal I knew of could make tracks like that. "Jesus Christ," Dale whispered, staring at the footprints. Those are huge." I bent down, tracing one of the footprints with my finger. It was real. It wasn't a dream. It had actually happened. Then the smell hit us. It was faint at first, but then it got stronger, a thick, musky, animalistic stench, like wild animal droppings, but magnified, overpowering. It made my stomach churn. "What is that smell?" Dale asked, wrinkling his nose. "I don't know," I said, "but it's awful." It was coming from the direction the tracks led into the woods. We didn't go any further. We didn't want to. We gathered up what was left of our gear, mostly just the fishing rods and a few odds and ends that hadn't been completely destroyed. We loaded it back into the truck. "Let's go," Dale said, his voice tight with fear. "Let's just get out of here." I didn't argue. We got back in the truck and drove away. We haven't been back to that river since, and we haven't talked about it much either. Dale and I made a pact that day, right there in the truck, covered in the smell of whatever that thing was, that we wouldn't tell anyone what we saw. People wouldn't believe us. They'd think we were crazy, and maybe we were, for going back there in the first place. But I know what I saw. We both know what we saw. A huge, hairy creature, screaming like a tortured soul, strong enough to tear apart a campsite like it was nothing. A creature that left tracks bigger than my foot, and a smell that still makes me gag just thinking about it. I've tried to make sense of it for years. Read books, watched documentaries, searched online, tried to find anything that could explain what we encountered that night. Some kind of bear? No bear is that big or screams like that. Some kind of Bigfoot thing, maybe, but those stories always seemed like, well, stories, not real life. But I know what's real. I was there, I heard it, saw it, smelled it. And to this day, 30-something years later, I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, heart pounding, hearing those screams in my head. And I still have no idea what the hell it was. And honestly, I don't think I ever want to find out. Story 12. It was dead quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your eardrums and makes you wonder if your hearing's gone bad. Just the low hum of the engine and the tires on the asphalt. No, not even asphalt. Gravel. Loose dirt and gravel spitting out behind the big rig. Cypress Creek in 95? Out there, forget asphalt. You were lucky if they bothered to smooth out the ruts in the road. It was after 3 a.m., maybe 3:30. I wasn't staring at the clock. Long haul routes screw up your sense of time anyway. You live in a weird bubble where days and nights blur, only marked by truck stops and stretches of highway. This was one of those stretches where you could drive for miles without seeing another light, another house, another sign of life. Just trees. Cypress trees mostly, dark shapes lining either side of the dirt road, blacker than the sky even. Sky was barely there, just a low, heavy blanket of clouds swallowing up the moon and stars. I was with Earl, my usual co-driver back then. Earl wasn't much for talking late into the night, mostly just grunts and the occasional snore if he fell asleep. But having him there was, well, it was company. Felt less like you were the only person left on Earth driving through nowhere. He was slumped over in the passenger seat, head against the window, breathing heavy. I glanced at him every now and then, making sure he was still breathing, honestly. He looked rough sometimes after a long shift, and these back roads in Florida, they weren't easy on anyone. I had the windows rolled up. AC was struggling but still kicking out some cool air, trying to beat back that Florida humidity even at night. It smelled a little like old plastic and pine cleaner in the cab, that cheap stuff they use at truck stops. Better than the swampy air outside, though. Or so I thought. We were just driving. That's it. Just eating up miles of this dirt road, heading back towards whatever depot we were supposed to be at in the morning. Brain was on autopilot, hands just guiding the wheel, eyes on the road ahead, scanning the darkness. You get good at seeing in the dark when you do this for a living. You learn to pick out the shapes, the shadows, the glint of eyes if there's any wildlife crossing the road. Mostly deer, sometimes raccoons, opossums. Nothing too crazy out in Cypress Creek normally, just the usual critters. Then the headlights hit it. At first, it was just a shape, dead center in the middle of the road. Headlights caught it, and it It reflected back in a weird way. Not like animal eyes reflecting, not shiny or bright, more like something dull, almost absorbing the light. I squinted, instinctively easing my foot off the accelerator. "Earl," I said, voice a little louder than normal, breaking the silence in the cab. He just grunted in his sleep, didn't even stir. Useless. I focused back on the shape. It was sitting, right in the middle of the dirt track, just sitting there like it was waiting for us. My first thought was deer. Yeah, maybe a deer caught in the headlights, frozen, but it looked big, even from a distance, bigger than any deer I'd ever seen. And the way it was sitting, wrong somehow, too upright, too deliberate. I slowed the truck to a crawl, engine rumbling low. I wanted to get a better look. I flicked on the high beams, flooding the road ahead with more light, cutting through the thick darkness. And that's when I saw it clearly. And deer was the last thing that popped into my head. It wasn't deer. It wasn't any animal I recognized. Not bear, not dog, not anything normal. It was like something had been put together wrong. It was sitting on its rear end, that much was clear, but it wasn't squatting. It was almost like it was sitting on its tail, though I couldn't see a tail that looked right. And it was tall. Even sitting, it was tall. Taller than I expected. Its legs, if you could call them that, were bent at odd angles, tucked up close to its body. And its front part, that's what got me first. It was its torso. That's the only word I can think of to describe it. Torso. It was smooth. Not furry or hairy like you'd expect an animal to be out here. Smooth, almost pale-looking in the headlights, like stretched skin over something. And it was long. Too long for the way it was sitting. It looked out of proportion, stretched vertically, like someone had taken a normal animal's body and pulled it upwards. Its arms, or front limbs, were thin, ridiculously thin, like sticks. And they were long, dangling down beside its torso, almost touching the ground even though it was sitting. They were pale, too, like the torso, and they ended in... I couldn't quite make out what was at the ends. Didn't look like paws, didn't look like hands. Just things, knobby maybe, in the shadows. And its head, that was the worst part. It was facing us directly. Head up, staring straight at the truck, even though it must have been blinded by the high beams. The head was small, way too small for the body, like they'd stuck a child's head on this thing. And it was pale, same color as the torso and limbs. No fur, no hair, nothing, just skin, stretched tight over bone maybe. And its face. I didn't get a good look at its face. It was mostly in shadow, even under the headlights. But I saw eyes, 2 eyes, reflecting just a tiny bit but not bright animal eyes. Dull, dark, almost empty. And they were fixed on us, staring right at the cab. It just sat there, motionless, staring at us. Not running, not moving, just watching. I remember my breath catching in my throat. My heart started hammering in my chest. This wasn't normal. This was something else. Something really, really wrong. I had this instant, icy feeling of wrongness, like every instinct in my body was screaming at me that I should not be seeing this, that I was looking at something that wasn't supposed to be here. Then the smell hit. It wasn't gradual. It was instant. 1 second, nothing much, just the stale AC air. The next second, this wave of stench slammed into the cab. It was thick, heavy, like a physical thing pushing in through the vents, through the seams in the doors, through the goddamn glass itself, it felt like. Rotten cabbage. That's the closest thing I can describe it as. But times 100. Like cabbage that had been left to rot in the sun for weeks, festering and turning black and green, mixed with something else. Something dead. Something decaying. It was nauseating, gut-wrenching. It burned your nostrils, made your eyes water. It tasted metallic almost, like bad meat. I gagged, instinctively clamping a hand over my mouth and nose. My stomach lurched. Beside me, Earl finally woke up. He sat bolt upright, eyes wide open, looking around wildly. "What the—" he choked out, voice thick with sleep. Then he smelled it, his face contorted. He started coughing, a deep, hacking cough, leaning forward and gagging. "Jesus Christ!" he wheezed, grabbing his own mouth. "What is that smell? Something died in here?" I shook my head, eyes still locked on the creature in the road. "Not in here," I managed to say, voice strained. "Outside." He followed my gaze, staring out the windshield, his eyes widening further as he took in the shape in the headlights. He stopped coughing, his breath catching in his chest, just like mine had. He pointed a shaking finger. What the hell is that?" "I don't know," I whispered, voice hoarse. "I don't know what it is." The smell was getting worse. It was like it was intensifying, growing stronger, rolling off of whatever that thing was in waves. And it was cloying. That's the word. It was cloying, sticking to the back of your throat, filling your lungs, making you feel sick and dizzy all at once. I felt sweat break out on my forehead, cold and clammy. My hands were shaking on the wheel. And then it moved. It was so subtle, so slight that for a second I wasn't sure I'd even seen it. But then I knew. It had shifted its weight. Just a tiny movement, like it was unfolding, getting ready to stand. And it started to turn its head, just a fraction, angling its face towards the side of the truck, towards my window. It was coming closer. I knew it, instantly. It was going to stand up and come towards us. Panic, pure, unadulterated panic seized me. Every rational thought, every bit of calm logic just evaporated. There was only one thing left in my head. Get out of here, now. I didn't think, I didn't plan. I just reacted. My foot slammed down on the clutch. I yanked the gear shift into reverse, and I stomped on the accelerator. The big rig roared to life, engine screaming as the tires spun in the loose dirt, spitting up rocks and dust. The truck lurched backwards, bucking and swaying violently, throwing Earl sideways in his seat. "What the hell are you doing?" he yelled, grabbing onto the dashboard, his eyes wide with terror. "Backing up! We gotta get out of here!" I shouted back, voice cracking with adrenaline. I didn't take my eyes off the road behind us, steering hard, trying to keep the truck straight on the narrow track. The rear-view mirrors were useless in the dark, bouncing and vibrating with the rough ride. I was driving blind, relying on pure instinct, just backing up as fast as I could, praying I wouldn't run off the road, praying I wouldn't flip the truck, praying that thing wasn't coming after us. I glanced forward just for a split second to check where it was. In the headlights, I saw it. It was standing now, slowly, awkwardly unfolding itself, those thin limbs stretching out, its pale torso rising up out of the darkness. It was even taller standing than sitting, much taller. And it was turning towards us. The smell was even worse now, if that was possible. It was like it was being amplified, radiating off of it in waves, filling the cab, choking us. Earl was still gagging, eyes streaming, struggling to breathe. I could feel it too, burning my throat and lungs, making my head spin. I kept the pedal floored, backing up faster and faster, the truck rattling and bouncing like it was going to fall apart. I didn't know where we were going. I didn't know if there was anywhere to turn around. I just knew we had to put as much distance between us and that thing as possible. Finally, after what felt like forever, I saw a wider spot in the road ahead in the dim light of the reverse lights. A slight curve, maybe, enough room to turn. I jammed on the brakes hard, the tires screeching, throwing us forward against the seatbelts. I wrestled the steering wheel, throwing the truck into a tight, clumsy three-point turn, engine roaring, gravel flying. All the while, in my mind's eye, I could still see it, standing in the middle of the road, watching us, staring with those dark, empty eyes, smelling like death and decay. I got the truck turned around, finally facing back the way we'd come. I slammed it into drive, foot down on the accelerator, and we shot forward, tires gripping, spitting gravel behind us. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if it was following. I just drove. faster than I should have been driving on that road, bouncing and swaying, headlights cutting a swathe through the darkness. We drove and drove, mile after mile, not saying a word. The smell slowly started to fade, to dissipate, until it was just a lingering foul taste in the back of my throat and a memory in my nostrils. The air in the cab slowly started to feel breathable again. Earl was still slumped in his seat, panting, pale as a ghost. I was shaking so bad I could barely hold the wheel straight. It was probably a good hour of hard driving before we finally hit a paved road again. Asphalt, smooth and black under the tires. Felt like heaven, like we'd finally escaped something. We didn't stop until we reached the first truck stop we saw. A bright, garish beacon of fluorescent lights and greasy food in the middle of nowhere. We pulled in, parked the rig, and just sat there for a minute, engine idling, staring straight ahead. Neither of us said anything for a long time. Finally, Earl turned to me, his voice still shaky. What was that?" he whispered, eyes wide and scared. I shook my head. "I don't know," I said, voice rough. "I honestly don't know. I've never seen anything like it." We sat in silence for a while longer. The noise of the truck stopped buzzing around us, radios blaring, engines revving, people yelling. A normal world, a world that felt completely separate from the nightmare we'd just driven out of. Then Earl said, We're not gonna tell anyone about this, right?" I looked at him. He knew. We both knew. No one would believe us. They'd think we were crazy, or drunk, or high. They'd laugh us out of the room. Who would believe a story like that? A story about a thing in the middle of a dirt road in Cypress Creek, smelling like death and rotting cabbage. I shook my head again. "No," I said. "No, we're not telling anyone. Ever." He nodded, relief flooding his face. "Good," he said. "Good. Just forget it ever happened, okay? Just wipe it from your memory. But you don't forget something like that. You just can't. No matter how hard you try. We never talked about it again, not really. Not in detail. We worked together for a few more months, drove routes all over Florida. But that night, that stayed between us, unspoken, a shared secret terror. Eventually we went our separate ways. Life happens, people move on. But I never forgot. I still drive trucks sometimes. Long haul, late nights, empty roads. And sometimes, when I'm driving through somewhere dark and quiet, somewhere that reminds me a little of Cypress Creek, I'll catch a whiff of something, just a faint hint of something rotten, something sickly sweet, carried on the wind, and my heart will skip a beat, and I'll find myself glancing into my mirrors, scanning the darkness behind me, just for a second, just to make sure it's not there, waiting in the road, watching, staring with those empty eyes, and smelling like death itself, and I still don't know what it was. To this day, I have no goddamn idea what we saw out there that night, and honestly, I don't think I ever want to know. Some things are better left unknown, some doors are better left unopened, and some roads are best just driven right past without stopping, without looking back. Because out there, in the darkness, in the middle of nowhere, sometimes there are things you just shouldn't see, and sometimes they see you back. Story 13. Okay, so listen, this is still something that messes with me even after all these years. It was back in '85, spring in Florida, Marina Beach to be exact. Picture this little coastal town, real sunshiny and bright, palm trees swaying, that kind of vibe. I was there with this realtor, Mrs. Davison, looking at houses. I was thinking about moving down, fresh start, warmer weather, the whole deal. We were driving down Beach Street, on our way to Pine Run. This area, she said, was really up and coming. Nice area, she was saying. Lots of potential. Honestly, I was mostly just enjoying the drive, windows down, feeling the breeze. Florida in spring, you can't beat it. We turned off Beach Street, onto this smaller road lined with trees. It got shady and cooler all of a sudden, and that's when I saw it. At first, it really looked like just some teenager standing by the side of the road, holding something long, like a stick or a pole, you know? Just some kid messing around. But as we got closer, something felt off, really off. It wasn't the way a kid would stand. It was stiff and bulky, even though it looked kind of skinny at the same time. Hard to explain. Then, out of nowhere, this thing just dropped. Not like fainted or anything, but like it decided to get on all fours. 1 second it was uprightish, the next it was down, low to the ground. And it moved. Fast. It wasn't running exactly, more like scrambling. But not like a dog or cat. It was wrong. The way it moved was completely unnatural. It went from the side of the road right out into the middle of the street. Then it stopped and just stood up again. But this time, standing on 2 legs, full on. Mrs. Davison slammed on the brakes. I mean slammed. The seatbelt dug into my chest and my coffee went flying. "What in the—" she started, and her voice was shaky. She wasn't a screamer, Mrs. Davison, usually pretty composed, but she was freaked. And honestly, so was I. We're stopped in the middle of this tree-lined road, car idling, staring at this thing. Up close, I could see it wasn't a kid. Definitely not a kid. It was hairy, dark, matted fur all over it, and tall. Taller than I thought when we were further back. I'm guessing 5, maybe 6 feet tall when it was standing, maybe even a little more. My first thought, and I actually said it out loud, was, "Is that a bear?" It was the only thing my brain could latch onto. Bears live in Florida, right? Maybe a bear got lost. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't right. The head was wrong, too small, too pointed almost. And the way it moved, even when it was standing, it wasn't like a bear. Bears are heavy, lumbering. This thing was wiry, lean. Mrs. Davison was still staring, her mouth open. "It can't be a bear, Emily," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Look at its face." And I did look, and that's when the real cold fear hit me. It didn't have a snout like a bear. It had a face, kind of. Not a human face, not exactly, but like something trying to be a face. The eyes were dark, deep set, and they were looking at us, watching us. It wasn't aggressive, not exactly. More like curious, but in a way that made my skin crawl. We both just sat there, frozen, staring at this thing in the middle of the road. It was just standing there on 2 legs, not moving, just looking. And it held something in its hand. The thing I'd first thought was a stick. But now I could see it wasn't a stick. It was longer, thinner, like a branch, or maybe even bone. I couldn't tell, and I didn't want to get close enough to find out. "Monkey?" I blurted out then, trying to grasp at anything familiar. Could it be a monkey, escaped from somewhere? Florida has monkeys, right? I'd seen them at zoos. Mrs. Davison shook her head slowly, still looking at the creature. "No tail, Emily. And monkeys aren't that big." She was right. No tail. And it was way too big for a monkey, way too big and wrong. Everything about it felt wrong. The way it stood, the way it looked, the silence. It was completely silent. No animal noises, no breathing sounds, nothing. Just this thing standing there staring at us. Then slowly it turned its head. Not towards us exactly, but just turned, like it heard something. And then just as slowly it moved. Not running, not even walking fast, just a slow, deliberate step towards the trees on the side of the road. It took another step, and then another, and then it just disappeared, melted into the shadows under the trees. 1 second it was there, the next, gone. Mrs. Davison and I just sat there in the car in silence for what felt like forever. Maybe it was only a minute, maybe more. I don't know. Time kind of stopped. Finally, Mrs. Davison let out a shaky breath. Did you see that?" she asked, like she needed to hear someone else confirm it. "Yeah," I said, my voice sounding hoarse. "Yeah, I saw it." What was that?" she asked, and her voice was almost pleading, like I might have some explanation, some rational answer. I don't know," I said. And honestly, that's the scariest part. I really didn't know, and I still don't. After a few more moments of stunned silence, Mrs. Davison put the car in gear. Very slowly, she pulled forward. Neither of us said anything for a while. We just drove. Further down that tree-lined road, towards Pine Run, like nothing had happened. But everything had happened. We kept driving west on Addison Drive, which Mrs. Davison said bordered this big green area, some kind of park or preserve. I think she mentioned state parks connecting together. She was still trying to get back to normal, pointing out houses, talking about property values. But her voice was still tight, and I could see she was glancing in her rearview mirror every few seconds. I know I was staring out the side window, watching the trees, half expecting to see that thing again. And then it happened again, not even 5 minutes later. We were still on Addison Drive, passing another stretch of woods. And there it was, again. Or was it the same one? I don't know. But it looked the same. It was further away this time, on the edge of the woods, right next to the road. It was crouching down this time, almost hidden in the bushes. As we got closer, it seemed to notice us. It stood up again, and this time it dropped the stick, just let it fall to the ground, and it moved forward, towards the road, towards us, and it just walked right out into the street, just like before. No hesitation, no fear, nothing, like it owned the place. Mrs. Davison braked again, not quite as hard this time, but still fast. We stopped maybe 10-15 feet from it. This time, we were closer. This time I could see it even clearer. And this time, it was even more unsettling. It stood there, upright, in the middle of the road, blocking our path. It wasn't running towards us. It wasn't growling. It wasn't doing anything threatening in a normal animal way. It just stood there, looking right at us. The way it stood. That was what got to me. It wasn't like a person standing. It wasn't quite human, but it wasn't like an animal standing on its hind legs either. It was somewhere in between. Unnatural. Wrong. It was taller this time. Or maybe it just seemed taller because we were closer. Maybe 5.5, 6 feet, maybe even taller. It was lean, but surprisingly muscular, covered in that dark, shaggy fur. The arms were long, way too long for a human. And the legs, they were long too, but kind of bowed, kind of strange looking. And the feet, I couldn't really see the feet clearly because of the bushes and the way it was standing, but they looked big, wrong-shaped. The face, God, the face. It was worse up close. The eyes were dark, like I said, but now I could see they were almost black, no white in them, just black, and deep-set under a heavy brow ridge. The nose was flat, almost pushed into the face. And the mouth, it was just a thin line, no lips really, just a line. And I could see teeth, small, pointed teeth. Not like human teeth, not like animal teeth I'd ever seen either. It just stared at us, just stared, and we stared back, frozen, scared, completely and utterly speechless. It was like we were in a trance, locked in its gaze. Then it started to move, again slowly, deliberately, but this time it started to walk towards us, slow, easy steps. But each step brought it closer to the car, closer to us. My heart started hammering in my chest. I could feel the blood rushing in my ears. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely feel them. I wanted to scream, but no sound would come out. I wanted to tell Mrs. Davison to put the car in reverse, to drive, to get us out of there. But I was paralyzed. It kept walking, slow step after slow step. It was maybe 10 feet from the car now, 8 feet, 6. It was getting closer and closer, and its eyes, those black eyes, they were fixed on us, just boring into us. Then, just when I thought it was going to reach the car, just when I thought it was going to, I don't know what, grab the door handle, smash the window, something, it stopped. Right in front of the car. Maybe 3 yards away, it just stopped. Standing there, looking right at us. And then it did the most unbelievable thing. It smiled. I know it sounds crazy, but it did. That thin line of a mouth, it stretched, pulled back, and those little pointed teeth, they were visible now. It was not a friendly smile, not a human smile. It was predatory, cold, cruel. It was like it was amused by our fear, like it was toying with us. That smile, that's what broke the spell. That's what snapped me out of it. And I finally found my voice. I yelled, not a scream exactly, more like a strangled shout. "Drive!" I screamed at Mrs. Davison. "Just drive!" Mrs. Davison reacted instantly. God bless her, she was a quick thinker under pressure. She slammed the gas pedal, the car lurched forward, and she swerved around the creature. We sped past it, tires screeching, and didn't stop. We just kept driving, faster and faster. We didn't look back. We didn't say anything. We just drove. All the way back to Beach Street, all the way back to town, all the way back to her office. We sat there in her office for hours, I think, just numb. She made us coffee, strong coffee, but I barely tasted it. We tried to talk about it, to make sense of it. We talked about bears again, monkeys again, wild dogs, anything we could think of that was even remotely plausible. But nothing fit. Nothing made sense. And the more we talked, the less real it felt. Like it was some kind of shared hallucination. But it wasn't. We both saw it. We both felt the fear. We both know what we saw. Something not human, not animal. Something else. Something wrong. I never bought a house in Marina Beach. I went back home the next day, and I never went back to Florida, not since then. I've tried to forget about it, tried to tell myself it was my imagination, or stress, or something else. But I can't. I still see it sometimes, in my dreams. Those black eyes, that smile, that feeling of pure, cold dread. And sometimes, when I'm walking in the woods or even just driving on a quiet road with trees on either side, I get this feeling, like I'm being watched, like something is out there, just beyond the trees, watching me. And I remember that day in Marina Beach, and I know, deep down, that there are things out there in the world that we just don't understand, things that are other, things that shouldn't be. And sometimes, if you're unlucky, you might just catch a glimpse of them. And once you do, you'll never forget it. And you'll never be quite the same again. I know I haven't been. And honestly, I still have no idea what it was. To this day, I have absolutely no explanation for what we saw that day. And that's the part that really gets to me. The not knowing, the uncertainty, the feeling that there's something out there, something real, something else. And we just drove away from it, left it behind in those woods, and it's still out there, somewhere. Story 14. Okay, so this happened years ago, back in 2011, October. You know how Florida gets in October, still kinda warm, but the days get shorter and the light gets different, sort of heavy and weird. I was heading out near Pearson, out past Palatka. You know that area where it's just woods and swamp? I was hunting hogs. That's my thing, always has been. I love being out in the woods, tracking the whole deal. Anyway, I was driving down 9 Mile Road. It's not really a road, more like a long, straight path that barely got paved at some point, and now it's mostly cracked and overgrown on the sides. It was getting late afternoon, the sun was already starting to dip, and the shadows were getting long. I was just cruising, windows down, listening to the radio low, just taking it easy and looking for signs of hogs. That's when I saw something, on the side of the road, in the ditch, something big and brown, hunched down low. I slowed the truck a little, trying to get a better look. At first, honestly, my brain just went to deer. You see deer all the time out there, but this was different. The way it was crouched, it was like it was trying to hide or something. But it was way too big to really hide in that ditch. I drove past it, and as I did, whatever it was, it stood up, slowly. And that's when I knew it wasn't a deer, or a bear, or anything I'd ever seen before. It was tall. Jesus, it was tall. I mean, I'm not a small guy myself, I'm about 6'5", and this thing, when it stood up straight, it was towering over the top of my truck. It was easily 8, maybe 9 feet tall, and it was just brown, dark brown, kind of shaggy looking. It started pacing back and forth on the edge of the road, right there in front of my truck, just walking from one side of the road to the other, then back again. It was like it was agitated or confused or something. Its movements were heavy, like it weighed a ton. The ground seemed to shake a little when it took a step. I was staring, just completely frozen. I mean, what do? You see something like that right in front of you in the middle of nowhere. My mind was racing. Bear? No way. Too tall. Wrong shape. Human? Hell no. No human is that big or moves like that. After a few seconds of pacing, it just crouched down again, just like that, lowered itself back into the ditch, like it was trying to disappear. But it was still right there. I could still see the top of its head and shoulders over the grass and weeds. I didn't stop. I didn't even really think about stopping. I just kept driving. Slowly at first, just to get past it. And then I sped up. Got the hell out of there. My heart was pounding in my chest. I was sweating even though it was getting cooler out. I drove straight to where I was meeting my buddy, Mark. We were supposed to be hunting together that afternoon. He was already there, waiting in his truck at the edge of the wildlife management area, just off County Road 315. I pulled up next to him and just sat there for a second, trying to catch my breath. He tapped on my window. I rolled it down, and he looked at me like, "What took you so long?" I just said, "Mark, you're not going to believe what I just saw." I told him about it, about the thing in the ditch, how tall it was, how it moved. He looked at me like I was nuts, like I'd been drinking or something, even though I hadn't had a single beer all day. "Dale, you sure it wasn't just a bear standing up?" he said. "Bears can get big out here." "Mark," I said, "I know what a bear looks like. I've seen bears my whole life. This wasn't a bear. This was something else." He still looked skeptical, but he knows me, knows I'm not someone who makes things up. He finally said, all right. Maybe it was just a really big deer. Or, I don't know. Let's just go hunting, forget about it." I wasn't about to forget about it, not ever, but I didn't want to argue with him. We'd planned this hunt for weeks. So we grabbed our gear and headed into the woods. We were in that wildlife management area near Lake George, you know, thick woods, lots of palmetto bushes, cypress swamp in places, perfect hog habitat. We started walking in, side by side at first, just moving slowly and quietly, listening for any sounds. We hadn't gone very far, maybe half a mile in, when we decided to split up a little. We weren't really far apart, still within shouting distance, but enough so we could cover more ground. Mark went to the left, I went to the right, keeping the tree line in sight, walking along the edge of the thicker woods. It was quiet, too quiet almost. You know how it is in the woods sometimes. Everything just gets still and silent. No birds chirping, no squirrels rustling around, just quiet. It makes you a little uneasy, that kind of quiet. I was walking slow, scanning the ground for tracks, listening for anything moving in the brush. That's when I heard it, rustling, over to my left in a patch of really thick palmetto and scrub oak. It wasn't like a deer rustling. Deer are quick and light on their feet. This was heavier, like something big moving through the underbrush, pushing branches aside, breaking twigs, and it was close, closer than I expected. I stopped dead still, raised my rifle and just listened. The rustling kept coming, getting closer. Whatever it was coming towards me. My heart started to beat faster again. Adrenaline started to pump. I thought, okay, maybe it's a hog, a big one. That's what I was hoping for anyway. Then I saw it. Just a glimpse at first. Movement in the bushes. Dark color, something bigger than a hog, I could tell that right away. I held my rifle steady, finger on the trigger, ready to shoot if I needed to. The rustling got louder, and then the branches parted, and I saw a face. Just a face at first, looking at me from behind the bushes. And shoulders. Big, broad shoulders. It was crouched down low, still mostly hidden by the foliage, but I could see its face and the top part of its body. And it was like nothing I'd ever seen in my life. It was human-like, in a way, but not human, not really. The face, it was kind of flat. The nose was pushed in, almost like an ape's, but not quite. The eyes, they were dark, intense, watching me. And the hair, it wasn't hair really, more like fur, dark, coarse fur, covering its face and shoulders. It was the same dark brown color I'd seen by the road, but with some black mixed in, like streaks of black through the brown fur. I knew instantly. This wasn't a bear. This wasn't a deer. This wasn't anything natural. This was the thing from the ditch, or something like it. It was crouched down maybe 15, 20 yards away from me, staring at me. I stared back. We were locked eye to eye, and I could see intelligence in its eyes. That's the thing that really freaked me out. It wasn't just an animal, it was something else. I'm telling you, I've seen bears in the woods. I've been around wild animals my whole life, and this was different. This was like looking into the eyes of something that was thinking, something that was aware. We just stared at each other for what felt like forever. Maybe a minute, maybe two. Time just seemed to stop. I didn't move. It didn't move. Just those dark eyes watching me from behind the bushes. Then it started to stand up. Slowly, just like before by the road. And as it stood, it got bigger and bigger, taller and taller, until it was towering over the bushes. And that's when I saw its full height, and it was even bigger than I thought. Way bigger. It made me feel small and scared. Really scared. I'm 6'5". I'm not a small dude, and this thing, it was easily 3, maybe even 4 feet taller than me. Standing upright, it was monstrous. 8, 9 feet tall, maybe even taller. It was solid muscle. Broad chest, thick shoulders, powerful-looking arms and legs. I couldn't see its lower body clearly because of the bushes, but I could see enough to know this wasn't something you mess with. And then it stood all the way up. Stood completely upright on 2 legs, just like a man, but not a man, not even close. It stood there for another second, just looking at me. Then it turned its back to me, and started walking, away from me, into the swamp. It moved fast, not running but fast walking, long strides, and as it walked I could hear its footsteps, heavy, pounding the ground. Thump, 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 getting fainter as it moved deeper into the woods. And then I smelled it. A smell hit me all of a sudden, strong, musky, like a wild hog, but stronger, much stronger, almost overpowering. It was a rank animal smell, like something feral and wild. Funny thing is, I'd actually picked that hunting area because I thought I'd smelled hogs there earlier that week. That's why I wanted to go back there. Turns out, it probably wasn't hogs I was smelling at all. I stood there, frozen, watching it go, listening to the heavy footsteps fade away, smelling that awful, strong animal smell. I couldn't move. I was just stunned. After a minute or two, when I was sure it was gone, I slowly lowered my rifle. My hands were shaking, my legs were shaking. I felt weak, like all the strength had been drained out of me. I turned around and walked straight back the way I came. Didn't even think about hogs anymore. didn't think about hunting. All I could think about was that thing, that face, those eyes, that size. I walked fast, back to where I'd left Mark. He was still there, hadn't even moved much. He looked up when he saw me coming, and he could see something was wrong. "Hey, what's up? You see anything?" he asked. I just shook my head. "Let's go, Mark," I said. "Let's just go." He looked at me confused. "Go? What about hunting? We just got here." "I don't care about hunting," I said. "I want to get out of here." He could tell I was serious. He could see the look on my face. He didn't argue. He just grabbed his stuff, and we walked back to the trucks without saying another word. We drove back home in silence. Mark tried to ask me what had happened a few times, but I just didn't want to talk about it. Not then. Not really ever. Later that night I told him everything. About seeing it by the road, about seeing it in the woods, about its size, its face, its eyes, the smell. He listened, quietly. He didn't laugh. He didn't say I was crazy. He just listened. He still thinks it was probably a bear. A really big bear. That's what he wants to believe anyway, but I know what I saw. I know it wasn't a bear, and I know it wasn't a deer, and it sure as hell wasn't human. To this day, I can still see its face. Those dark eyes staring at me. I can still smell, that rank, wild animal smell. It was the most scared I've ever been in my life, and I don't scare easily. I never went back to that wildlife management area. Not to hunt, not for anything. And I still think about it sometimes, wonder what it was, wonder if it's still out there, watching. I don't have any answers. I just have this memory, this thing that happened to me, out in the woods in Florida, that day in October. And I can't explain it, I just can't. It's like it just happened and then stopped, just like that. Story 15. I'd been out there hunting since the afternoon. It was getting close to sunset. The woods were starting to get that golden hour light. But then it started to shift, get longer shadows, that deeper kind of quiet that happens when the day's almost done. I was heading towards a little creek I'd stumbled on earlier, figuring it would be a good water source and a decent spot to pitch the tent. Honestly, up until then, it was a pretty normal day in the woods. A little quiet, maybe, but normal quiet, if that makes sense. But then, it was like something just flipped. The feeling started subtly, just this prickle on the back of my neck. Like when you're walking alone at night and you just know someone's watching you. Except it was daylight, or fading daylight anyway, and I was in the middle of nowhere. I stopped for a second, scanning around. Nothing. Just trees, the creek babbling, birds starting to settle down for the night. I told myself I was being stupid. Woods will do that to you, play tricks on your mind. Probably just some deer or something. I kept walking, but the feeling didn't go away. It actually got worse. Heavier, if that's the word. Like actual eyes on me, boring into me. It was making my skin crawl. I started looking around more, actually trying to see if there was anything out there. Still nothing. Just woods. I reached the creek, found a decent flattish spot near the bank, and started unpacking my gear to set up the tent. I wanted to get it done before it got too dark. The quicker the better now, because this feeling was seriously freaking me out. I was halfway through getting the poles sorted, wrestling with those new tent zippers that always get stuck when something moved in my peripheral vision. It was dark, a really deep, dark shadow against the fading light of the woods, and it was big. I froze, dropping the tent pole I was holding. Slowly, I turned my head to the side, not wanting to make any sudden moves, and that's when I saw it. Standing maybe 20 yards away, just inside the tree line, was this thing. Honestly, I don't know what else to call it. It was massive. Tall, I mean easily 7, maybe 8 feet tall, and just bulky, covered in thick dark fur, almost black in the dim light, but I could see it was matted, like really dense, coarse fur. It was just standing there, perfectly still, watching me, My heart slammed into my chest. Every muscle in my body went rigid. I couldn't breathe right. I was just staring, and it was staring back. Even from that distance, I could see its face. It wasn't like an animal face exactly. It was almost human, but wrong. Its skin under the fur around its face seemed lighter, kind of a dark grey. It had dark brown eyes, deep set, and they were intense, like they were focused completely on me, like I was the only thing in the world. Its nose. That's what really freaked me out. It was like mine, but bigger, wider, flatter, almost pushed in. It wasn't snouty like a dog or pointed like a deer. It was a nose, just wrong. And its expression, that's the part that really sticks with me. It wasn't angry or aggressive or anything I expected. It was stern, serious, like it was judging me. Just this heavy, intense stare. We stood there like that, locked eye to eye, for what felt like forever. But it was probably only 10, maybe 15 seconds. Time kind of stretches out when you're that scared. Then its face changed, just subtly, but it changed. The sternness softened, just a little. And I swear to God, this sounds crazy, but I felt like it was trying to tell me something, not with words, obviously, but I got this overwhelming feeling like a message being pushed into my head, and the message was clear. Leave. Get out of here. Now. Instinct took over. I didn't think, didn't hesitate, didn't even grab my rifle, which was leaning against a nearby tree. I just turned around and started walking. Fast walking at first, then it turned into a jog, then full-on running towards the direction of the dirt road I'd come in on. The tent, my gear, everything I brought with me, I just left it all. Didn't even cross my mind to go back for it. All I could think about was getting away. I ran until my lungs burned, pushing through branches, stumbling over roots, just heading in the general direction I thought the road was. I didn't dare look back. I could still feel those eyes on me, even with my back turned. That feeling of being watched didn't let up for a long time. After maybe 5-10 minutes of running, I was completely winded, starting to get that stitch in my side, and I forced myself to slow down to a fast walk. It was getting properly dark now, the last bits of sunset fading into twilight. The woods were getting real quiet again, that deep woods night quiet, but this time it wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, ominous. As I was walking, trying to catch my breath and still keep moving as fast as I could, something caught my eye off to the side of the trail. It was weird. A line of rocks, standing upright in the ground, like small flat stones stuck on end, all in a row. They weren't just scattered randomly, they were lined up, almost perfectly spaced, maybe 10 or 12 of them, stretching out for maybe 30 feet or so. Each stone had a little mound of dirt at its base, like a mini grave, and around each mound someone had stuck sticks in the ground, making little square boxes around them, like crude wooden fences around tiny graves. And then, on either side of this row of stones, further into the woods, I saw trees that had been bent over, snapped or forced into this weird X shape, their tops touching the ground. It looked intentional, like someone had deliberately set this whole thing up. I stopped to look at it, completely confused. What the hell was this place? Was it some kind of old cemetery? But it didn't look like a normal graveyard. It felt older, and definitely unsettling. There was something deeply wrong about it, a coldness in the air even though it wasn't cold. I was still standing there staring at these stones and bent trees, trying to make sense of it, when something hit me, hard, in the ribs, right under my arm, like someone had thrown a rock at me. And then I heard it, a roar, but not like any roar I've ever heard before, not like a bear, not like a mountain lion. It was deeper, throatier, more guttural, like a bear but mixed with something else, something almost human, like someone screaming in pure rage, but animal at the same time. It was coming from the woods, from the direction of those stones. Multiple roars, all at once, echoing through the trees. Then stones started flying. Small ones at first, pebbles, hitting the ground around me, snapping twigs. Then bigger ones, golf ball sized, like the one that hit me. They were coming from the trees, from the dark. I couldn't see anything clearly, but I could hear rustling, movement in the underbrush, and those terrifying roars. It sounded like more than one of them. Panic flared up again, 10 times worse than before. I didn't need to see what was throwing those rocks to know I needed to get out of there. I turned and ran again, stumbling, scrambling through the woods in the dark, completely blind now. Just running, driven by pure terror. I was running for my life. I knew it, deep down. Whatever was out there in those woods, it wanted me gone, and it wasn't going to stop with throwing rocks. I finally burst out onto the dirt road, gasping for breath, my side aching, my heart pounding like it was going to explode. I could hear the roars fading behind me, still echoing through the trees, but getting fainter as I got further away. I kept running down the road, didn't stop until I saw my truck parked up ahead, just a dark shape in the night. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so bad I could barely get them in the lock. I ripped the door open, practically dove into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and locked it. Then I just sat there for a second, panting, trying to calm down, listening for anything coming after me. That's when I saw them. Smudged, muddy handprints all over the passenger side window. Huge prints, way bigger than any human hand. Long fingers, thick palms, smeared right across the glass, like something had leaned up against the truck, watching me as I ran. I didn't waste another second. I jammed the key in the ignition, turned it, and thank God the engine roared to life. I slammed it into reverse, backed out onto the road, spun the wheels, and then floored it, heading back the way I came, back towards civilization, leaving everything behind. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on the highway, streetlights flashing past, the woods far behind me. The next day, or maybe it was a couple days later, I told my cousin everything that happened. He listened, looking a bit pale, but not totally surprised. He said he'd had weird feelings out there before, camping on his land, seen things he couldn't explain, but nothing like what I described. When I told him about the stones, the standing rocks and the bent trees, he went quiet for a minute. Then he said real slow, "Sounds like you found one of the old burial sites." Burial sites? What did he mean? He explained that there were old stories, local legends about the area, going way back, long before anyone white settled there. Stories about things that lived in the woods, things that weren't animal, weren't human, but something in between. He said some people believed there were still places in the deep woods where they were honored or appeased. He didn't go into much detail, didn't seem to want to. He said he'd go check it out the next day, see if he could find the place I was talking about. He came back about 4 hours later, and he was different, visibly shaken, white as a ghost. I asked him what he saw, what he found. He just shook his head, wouldn't look me in the eye. "Don't go back there, Ethan," was all he said. "Just don't." He's never spoken about it since. Whenever I bring it up, he just clams up, changes the subject. He sold that piece of land a couple of years later. And me? I still go hunting, but I don't camp in the woods alone anymore, not ever. And I definitely don't go anywhere near my cousin's old land. I can still see that thing's face in my head sometimes, those dark eyes, that stern, almost sad expression, and that feeling that I'd stumbled into someplace I wasn't supposed to be, somewhere sacred or dangerous. I don't know what it was, what those creatures were, what those stones were, and I don't think I ever want to know. Sometimes it's better to just walk away and not look back. Some things out there in the world, they're just not meant to be found.